Sweet lies and bitter truths from olden men of hateful dens enter brains of new youths. Therein lies a small seed, a thought planted to color creeds, to fight amongst and not against, kin at arms with no amends. In centuries past, his story told, what once was young is now so old, but sweet lies and bitter truths, like fine wines ever enshrined, still spread to lively youths deep entrenched within our roots. Not gonna lie, making this YouTube video was probably inevitable given how much I subject those around me to hour-long rants, but on the bright side, instead of forcing others to watch a live rendition of me molding and tweaking the hell out, I can now have a willing audience opt into hearing it instead. With that said, you've probably read the title of this video and have a general idea of what I might discuss. Asian hate crimes, recent examples of them, what the data may suggest, and yes, some more unspoken truths about those who may be behind the violence against Asian Americans. And if you caught on to what the title may have been alluding to, then unfortunately, you might have got clickbaited. Now, before you click off this video, while I'm not going to confirm any preconceived notions or negative beliefs about a specific marginalized group, I will let y'all in on a little secret they kept hidden about race narratives in America. So, provocative title aside, no, this isn't going to be a video about me ragging on black people and blaming them for beating Asian grannies in the streets, or a place where I make some grandiose claims about how Asians as a hardworking minority group are undeserving of any criticism or resentment from other marginalized communities. But instead, this video will examine why certain narratives online tend to depict such events as an unspoken truth and how the real insidious nature of Asian hate crimes are often obscured to the naked eye. So, even though I kind of let the cat out of the bag, for those who may have clicked onto this video still confused as to what the title may be referring to, or those of y'all itching to hear how other minority groups may be intrinsically intertwined with Asian hate, in short, since the start of COCO-19, a popular narrative has been spread that the proliferation of Asian hate has been largely committed through a singular group, and the blame of this narrative is aimed towards the black community. Now, before I get into the meat and potatoes of the issues and explain why it exists, but also why it's spread into certain spheres of social media as an unspoken truth, we're gonna need to start back at the beginning, all the way back in 2019, 2 years ago. Basically, long ago, the four races lived in harmony, but not really. Then, everything changed when the outbreak occurred. Only the president, master of all forms of oppression, could stop it. But when Asian Americans needed him most, he didn't do shit. 5 years have passed, and the narrative is still that Asian hate crimes are predominantly committed by black people. And although this narrative is utter garbage, many still spread it today. But I believe truth can save America. So, for those unaware, COCO-19, or the beer virus, originated in China during the latter half of 2019. From there, it eventually busted out of Wuhan and disseminated itself across the globe like your favorite celebrity's carbon emissions. And us Americans, being all about freedom and such, naturally, we happily accepted the virus with open arms. Into our country, as well as our nostrils, and our mouths, and our lungs. And from that point onward, it would begin to spread, eventually proliferating to the extent where COCO-19 ceased to be solely a meme and evolved into a serious national health crisis. Naturally, with the origins of the virus originating from China, it made it quite easy for our government to scapegoat the blame towards Asian countries instead of themselves. So, with the government's choice of blaming the management of the pandemic elsewhere, it wouldn't be surprising to hear some argue that it wasn't the government's fault that the pandemic wasn't properly managed, or that the government had an initially abysmal response to it. It was them damn Chinamen. After all, why would it be officially recognized as a China virus if it wasn't manufactured in some secret communist Wuhan library for the sake of ravaging America's economy? And you know what? Now that I think about it, I'm pretty sure there's a few of those Chinamen in our good old US of A as well. Maybe they're secretly involved. But caricature aside, it wasn't always like this for Asian Americans. You see, we weren't always viewed as a virally infected Chinamen out to destroy the American way. In fact, up until COVID had started, we were actually model minorities. A shining beacon representative that hard work could overcome any hardship and lead to the promised American dream and financial success. Or were we yellow perils? Actually, it's kinda confusing, so let me clear things up. I might dive further into this in another video, but in the interest of keeping things concise and to the point, Asian immigration to America began during the 1850s, back when the country was in need of cheap surplus labor. Needing all the manpower that they could muster for the sake of American expansion and manifest destiny, the US government and companies within began exporting Chinese immigrants into America to meet increasing labor demands, being paid under that of which a typical citizen was offered while simultaneously working in more perilous conditions. These immigrants were touted as ideal migrants or the model minority for working hard at a cheap price and with little to no complaints. The epitomized example of a perfect labor for any industrial endeavor. But that wasn't exactly the truth. You see, it wasn't necessarily the case that the immigrants wanted to take on worse conditions compared to their American peers. They just simply didn't have the autonomy, economic, or linguistic capabilities with which to demand better conditions, and being unable to properly spur any improvements for themselves, the unsatisfactory situations of the Chinese immigrants endured onwards. However, following a recession that occurred later in the century, many Americans who had refused the lower compensation and harsher working conditions of their Asian counterparts found themselves with neither employment nor pay, and as a result, they resorted to accusing their Asian peers of being dangerous yellow perils, responsible for stealing American jobs from deserving citizens, leading to the ruin of the country's economy. But eventually, the economy would recover, and the demand for supplemental Chinese laborers would rise again, and thus, their status as model minority was restored, and they lived happily ever after. Not really. You see, these stereotypes weren't just a one-time thing, and they weren't limited exclusively to the Chinese either. Living in a country and working there so long, it makes sense that the Chinese laborers will eventually pick up on some English and attain some insight into their economic inequality between themselves and their American peers. And unsurprisingly, once some of the workers managed to achieve some representation, economic, and linguistic abilities, they were able to organize and collectively demand for higher salaries and better working conditions. But as a businessman, you're not exactly incentivized to pay your workers any more than you have to if you want to maintain profit margins as high as possible. So, with the men in control of the industries wanting to keep labor costs as low as feasible, they would soon opt to replace their current laborers with other immigrants from another Asian country who are willing to take the price originally offered to the Chinese and share the same linguistic and economic disadvantages as the laborers before them. And from Chinese to Filipino to Indian and so on, a cycle was created, repeating the transition whenever the chance for Asians to unionize arose. And as history has shown of all nations, there inevitably comes rises and dips in the economy, and thus, the cyclical transition of model minority to yellow peril rotated in perpetuity from one Asian group to another, with the cheapest ethnic group at the time obtaining the mythical model minority status, only to later transform into yellow perils in times of recession and eventually fall victim to replacement. However, the cycle eventually halted, occurring in recent history after the events of World War II. Rather than position one Asian group against each other and have them compete for the status of model minority, the government would later deem black people in the civil rights movement as a bigger threat to the status quo, and so they decided to grant a universal model minority status in a form consolidated to encompass all Asians within America, but not as an act of gratuity to free them from competing against one another, but instead to position them in opposition to black Americans and other marginalized ethnic groups within the United States. But how does that explain Asian hate crimes today, you may ask? Well, you see, the model minority status granted to Asian Americans wasn't actually the permanent status they initially presented it as. More so, the title was a temporary one granted due mostly in part to convenience rather than aid. And while gaining this new status in tandem with legislative changes that allowed Asian immigrants to access citizenship and further rights proved beneficial in aiding Asian Americans towards their pursuit of financial success, beliefs of the yellow peril never truly subsided in the minds of many. As proof of this, despite being touted as that ideal minority group, Zhang et al. Note in Hate Crimes Against Asian Americans Today that regardless of the success attained by Asian Americans, hate crimes were still perpetuated out of fear towards the yellow peril, such as the infamous murder of Vincent Chin in 1982, whose murderers screamed, "It's because of you that we're out of work." And even over 100 years since the first Asian immigrants stepped foot on native soil, the view of Asians as yellow perils never truly left the subconscious of many Americans. Therefore, while it may appear today that Asian Americans have a concrete identity as a head-down, hard-working minority able to achieve the American dream and strike down the complaints of other marginalized communities, being Asian in America to this day constitutes living a tumultuous dual identity. The model minority myth was always the A-side to the Song of Asian Americans, just as the yellow peril was always its B-side. Simply lying in the shadows like an inactive Yu-Gi-Oh! Trap card waiting to be sprung in terms of necessity by the American government. And when they needed Asian Americans as a convenient scapegoat to shift blame of the 2019 pandemic, you bet your ass they sprung that shit. If you find yourself confused by the example because you were born after songs got done in by iTunes, well, sucks to suck. Just look it up, dude. I can't do everything for you. Okay, I lied. Please don't click off this video and give me all your watch time. Basically, a physical track record is a flat disc that records a song on it. And to maximize song storage on a singular disc, record companies imprinted songs on either side of the album, referring to one side as the A side and the other as the B side. So, depending on which song you want at the moment, you put it in that side of the disc, and depending on which perceptions of Asian Americans best suits the government's needs, they'll either play us as model minorities or flip us into dangerous yellow perils. Also, as a side note, no one should want to be a model minority. If you get why the government might want Asian Americans to be seen as yellow peril to scapegoat COVID measures and escape accountability over how they initially handled the spread of COVID-19, but find yourself perplexed as to why they'd position us as model minorities, it's because being a model minority benefits them rather than us. It's not like the system that will gladly frame us as viral sniffle spreaders is looking out for our best interests. In fact, the reason it's called the model minority myth is because that shit isn't real. It's a positive stereotype with negative implications and consequences, and for clarity's sake, me calling it a positive stereotype does not mean it's a good thing. It simply means that it's a stereotype that ascribes positive traits to a group that can't actually be fully attained. An example of this stereotype's negative implications goes, if all Asians are good at math, what happens to the Asians who aren't good at math? We can't all be good at math. The concept of good isn't possible without the existence of average or bad. So if you're an Asian American who happens to be shitty at math like me, you're basically lesser than and viewed as a failure of your own kind. Again, in the interest of staying on topic, I'll save this issue for another video, but low-key, a lot of y'all Asians are for real trying to be on some model minority bullshit, completely oblivious to how that negatively affects not just yourself, but other marginalized groups as well. Now, let's head back to the future. Up until before the outbreak, the state has been perfectly fine heralding Asian Americans as model minorities. But after being confronted with backlash due to a lack of action during the initial outburst of coronavirus, the government, in quick need of a potential scapegoat, decided to flip that track onto its B-side. And from 2020 onward, the yellow peril made a prominent resurgence for the first time in decades. Now, of course, the United States has been securitizing China for generations, as well as other Asian countries unaligned to American hegemony, and giving those nations their fair share of yellow peril notoriety. But in regards to Asian Americans living here in the Freedom Lands, we have long since been their golden child, the so-called hard-working head-down minorities who pull themselves up by the bootstraps and attain the American dream through hard work contrasting the complaints of other marginalized groups. But with large-scale outrage towards the effects of the pandemic spreading across the states, rather than prioritize us as a weapon against ourselves and other minorities, they deemed it more beneficial to position us as a threat with which the general population could validate and funnel their pandemic-induced rage. And thus, the coronavirus was deemed the China virus and Asian Americans a yellow peril upon the country. Now, if you're Southeast or Eastern Asian, or of any other Asian descent outside of China, you may be wondering why you should care and how you fit into all of this. Well, even if you're not Chinese, you ain't really out of the woodworks. In fact, you're kind of stuck in the middle of the forest. Let me explain. The crimes that have been enacted against us are called Asian American hate crimes for a reason, not hate crimes against Chinese Americans, and that reason is a concept called monolithilization. If you've never heard of that term before, it's probably because I made it up. That's right, I do be cool like that. But basically, monolithilization is the idea that a group of differing things can be lumped together and identified under certain conditions that are similar, while also being forced to shed any unique conditions that diversify and differentiate them. Specifically, in reference to Asian Americans for the purpose of this video, but it can also be used as a lens of analysis towards other races as well. But at its core, monolithilization explains why all East and Southeast Asians alike, and not just the subsect of Chinese Americans, have been subjected to an increase in violence against them since the spread of COVID-19. Because while you can shout from the rooftops that you aren't Chinese as loud as you want, if you're a yellow-skinned Asian American, racists can't really tell the difference between someone from China, Laos, Kazakhstan, Korea, or the Philippines. And telling people you're not a Chinaman isn't really gonna cut it. It's like fighting to be a model minority all over again. So if you haven't understood that you can't fulfill the conditions required to ever be seen as a model minority, then please realize that now. You can say you're not Chinese and discriminate against Chinese Americans, claiming and contribute to the antagonism of Chinese Americans, similar to how other Asians did the Japanese dirty during World War II with American internment camps. But if we're being honest, most Americans will probably never be able to tell us apart, and even if they eventually could, they probably wouldn't care to put the effort in to learn the differences. So as far as I'm concerned, if you're East or Southeast Asian, or yellow passing in general, you're ultimately as much of a chink as I am in the eyes of others. So know, regardless of how much money you make, how educated you are, how often you bleach your skin, or how you manage to fit in with other racial groups that are non-Asian, you will never have access to be seen outside the color of your race. And in interest of staying on topic, I'm just gonna nip the bud early. Y'all don't even want me to get started on racial whitening. That ain't gonna solve your issues either. So once again, I prevent myself from sidetracking by saying that this will be another topic for another time. But to really observe the effects of the pandemic in increasing Asian hate across the country, we can't just use anecdotal evidence. Rather, we need to combine that with an examination of both statistics and a few select cases of COVID-era Asian hate that have actually occurred. However, before diving into any stats, I just want to take a brief moment to thank the sponsors of this video. Me, motherfucker, I'm sponsoring myself. Watch my shit, it's fire, subscribe, all that other stuff. Leave an angry message that I clickbaited y'all, I don't care. Just be sure to stay tuned for the next video and I'll release it whenever that happens.
We do not care.
As proof of this occurrence, we need look no further than the data provided by the government itself. As reported by the US Department of Justice in 2020, although the number of reporting agencies decreased by 452 since 2019, which is probably indicative that the amount of hate crimes shown leads towards underreporting, the overall number of reported incidents increased by 949, and specifically regarding those related to Asian Americans, there entailed a total of 279 anti-Asian hate incidents regarding 2020, constituting a 77% increase since 2019. To easily visualize this, imagine you have a loving mom who packs you cookies to bring to school. However, to no fault of your mom's, you never get to eat all your cookies. Why? Because you've had a bully all throughout education. Let's call her Tony. Now Tony is a big back motherfucker, and since you don't have lunch money because your loving mom packs you homemade food instead of subjecting you to processed American sustenance, she instead steals your cookies. Every time it's lunch, like clockwork, Tony takes 4 of your cookies. However, one day, you hear of something called the Kool-Aid disease because one kid from another school who also eats packed lunches was sick and happened to drink a bottle of expired Kool-Aid. Now, all lunch packers are suspected of packing the disease-inducing Kool-Aid. So in order to punish you for being a lunch packer, Tony decides to start stealing an additional 3 cookies on top of the previous 4. And from that point onward, you now effectively get 7 cookies stolen from you whenever Tony sees you at lunch. How does this relate to Asian hate? Well, instead of cookies, just imagine those cookies as Asian grannies, Tony as perpetuators of hate crimes, and getting cookies stolen equivalent to getting beat on the streets. And since the start of COVID-19, wherever 4 Asian grannies used to get beat on the streets, it's now increased to 7 Asian grannies getting beat instead. But honestly, that might be a lowball estimate. Depending on where you live, if you happen to reside with a more urban community, there's typically a larger concentration of diversity compared to rural or suburban America, and you might be at greater risk. While the 77% increase in anti-Asian hate denotes a nationwide trend, Asian hate crimes have seen an upward increase of 149% within America's largest cities, despite an overall 7% drop in hate crimes from 2019 to 2020. And unsurprisingly, with the stark increase in American hate crimes towards Asian Americans, it comes with no shock that a large diffusion of fear and dread across Asian America would naturally follow. And with the combined threat of both plague and violence used against Asian Americans venturing beyond their homes, the Pew Research Center reported that 33% of Asian adults say that they feared someone might threaten or physically attack them. Now, would that fear come to Praxis? Probably not. For the majority of Asian Americans, just like the majority of Americans who haven't fallen victim to any significant crimes in general, it's most likely not the case that leaving their homes would have led to an incident involving physical violence against them. However, just because it wasn't statistically likely didn't mean that their fears were unwarranted. just as my fear of how turning off the lights in my living room could lead to a monster getting me in the dark if I didn't run up the stairs fast enough is both super unlikely and yet strangely valid, the increased fear of having their safety threatened was equally valid for Asian Americans during peak COVID era. The only notable difference, of course, is that Asian hate crimes have actually occurred, while those chased by monsters in the dark have all miraculously managed to survive. So don't worry about the monster throwing hands, worry about the humans around you. While there would be too many cases of Asian hate crimes for me to cover in depth during this video, one of the more notable examples for features of which I will later discuss is an instance of an Asian elderly getting attacked in San Francisco. So, during a typical morning in San Francisco's Market Street, an elderly woman in her 70s, Ms. J, a street vendor, was resting on a light pole in the street when Mr. Jenkins, her assailant, decided to attack her and another Asian elderly man, 83-year-old Mr. Pham. After attacking Mr. Pham, the attacker was met with self-defense and quickly fled the scene, but not before running into Ms. J and attacking her soon after. And like his victims before, Ms. J decided to stand on business, calling her assailant a bum and subsequently laying the attacker out on a stretcher with the aid of a nearby security guard. Unbeknownst to those involved, however, was a security camera that had captured the incident, and soon after, the video took to the news, going viral as an example of one of the many Asian hate crimes that occurred during the beginning of COVID. Unsurprisingly, once the incident made the news, the event was followed by outrage across Asian America, angered over the notion that individuals would attack an elderly. Thankfully, although Ms. J was unharmed, she was harmed. Thankfully, although Ms. J was harmed during the attack, she would make a full recovery and her family helped her set up a GoFundMe to garner her support. Later, the GoFundMe would surpass $1 million, and Ms. J, being empathetic to those who had fallen victim to similar events as her earlier, decided to donate the bulk of the earnings to a non-profit aimed at assisting the many victims of hate crimes. Now, while the case of Ms. J reached an eventual conclusion, the majority of hate crimes across America typically end without proper resolution. More often than not, hate crimes go unprosecuted for a variety of reasons. Whether the hate crime wasn't caught on video, there lacked the use of slurs confirming racially charged intent, or the attacks weren't deemed grievous enough, most hate crimes that occur in America simply never reach the light of day. And beyond the onslaught of explanations that may clarify why a case never makes it to court, this is often compounded by the fact that many victims face a language barrier in reporting and understanding the words used by their attackers, and that hate crimes as a category by itself is monstrously underfunded and unprioritized by the police. Therefore, though most of the crimes against Asian folks failed to be properly identified as a hate crime, with consideration to the large uptake in crimes against Asian folks post-COVID, it's quite evident that a large quantity of them were likely racially motivated. In the case of Ms. J, the aid of public outrage and her status as an elderly woman depicted as innocent and vulnerable and unable to defend herself most certainly helped her case, as she could be described as a perfect victim. In contrast, victims of Asian hate crimes may find themselves in more precarious circumstances if they happen to be younger, more able-bodied, and viewed in a less sympathetic lens by the general public. Because while we can all recognize that an elderly Asian woman being subject to unprovoked attack is wrong, it may be harder for those of the general populace to sympathize with a scenario where a younger Asian man exchanges verbal blows with a middle-aged white woman who initiated via the use of verbal slurs before evolving into an exchange of fists. But beyond that, it's worthwhile to note that violence isn't just limited within tangibility. That's to say, harms against Asian Americans after COVID-19 isn't just something that you can see or an action that can be physically felt. And we can see this present itself as the case when the study from Pew Research mentioned earlier concluded that almost half of Asian Americans reported having experienced either worries of physical violence, noticing people acting uncomfortable around them, being subjected to racist slurs, having experienced an individual blame them for the outbreak, or experiencing people telling them to go back to Asia. And I know people who think that they should get over it love to coin the phrase "sticks and stones may break my bones, but your words can't hurt me," but that's some actual cap. Oftentimes, words and things internal are what leads to violence. After all, before you can do it, you have to think it. And I can't think of an easier way to demonstrate this to y'all than with the example of jump scares and Michael Jackson. Now, We can all agree that getting jump scared or startled in general sucks. I mean, I can remember my first experience with being jump scared as if it was yesterday. I was scrolling YouTube sometime around 2010 and I came across a video claiming to have a recording of Michael Jackson's Ghost. Of course, 10-year-old me at the time had to click the video to see if it was true, and when the recording depicted a still hallway with ominous noise, little me didn't know what to expect. But then, a shadow quickly zoomed across the hall, and when I leaned in to see if it would happen again, a zombie Michael Jackson's freaky ass popped out and screeched at me in full blast, causing me to physically jolt back and experience some of the heaviest heart palpitations I've had till date. And despite having experienced many better jump scares since, I still to this day have to admit that was one of the most visceral reactions I've ever experienced with horror. And the science of jump scares explains why. You see, jump scares aren't just mental. They're a visual trigger that elicits a physical reaction out of us. Just as if zombie Michael Jackson was actually attacking you, your body literally reacts to a sudden change that your brain interprets as a threat. But while a jump scare may cause us to fall out of our seats, the reaction to it doesn't really scare us by itself. Thankfully, there are alternative methods with which horror films unnerve their audiences. More often than not, horror films with solely jump scares tend to miss the mark. Sure, it could potentially give me PTSD of being jumped by MJ, but it kinda gets old if the movie can only trigger a physical reaction. After all, watching a movie with only jump scares would be the equivalent to watching Forrest Gump strapped onto a randomly triggering taser. And yeah, being shocked sucks, but you're not really scared by the shock itself so much as you're, well, shocked. For good horror films, they often involve being able to walk the fine line between being able to jump scare you and being able to elicit a much deeper sense of fear. And how do they do this? Through the use of dread. While most are focused on the jump scare itself, dread and feelings alike are essential to actual horror. Anxiety and worry can often cause just as much fear and discomfort as the scare itself. Not only do you have to worry about the scare, but you have to be worried about the space leading up to the scare and when the dread kicks in. By the way, if y'all want to learn more about this, Super Eyepatch Wolf has a great video on this called How Media Scares Us that I recommend. But did I just completely go off the rails and have a tangent about horror films? Maybe. But I promise you that this is essential towards grasping the effects of racism and hate crimes on marginalized communities, especially if you as an individual haven't experienced marginalization yourselves. Just like the opening of a horror film, everything seems fine and dandy for Asian Americans prior to COVID. After all, no one expects to be jump scared at the start of a horror movie, especially if you didn't know you were watching a horror film in the first place. In the same rationale, many Asian Americans didn't expect to meet any racial aggression when they believed themselves to be model minorities. But clearly, the curtains were lifted once the pandemic occurred. And much like how the sudden realization you're watching a horror movie may worry you, Asian Americans realized that they had switched from A side to B side and that the position of Yellow Peril now opened their eyes to a new reality of external violence and oppression. You see, the effects of anti-Asian hate crimes were much the same, except we can sub out jump scares with instances of physical violence and the fear of getting jump scared or attacked with the psychological dread before it. So, more than just falling victim to anti-Asian hate crimes, Asian Americans also had to contend with the fear and anxiety that afflicted them whenever they left their homes, wondering whether that day would be the day that statistics would cease to be statistics and that they could potentially become the victims seen in true crime documentaries that we cognitively understand as real, but never effectively acknowledge the existence of. Just as I said earlier, psychological violence is still violence, so we as people should be uniquely cognizant of how our actions could leave both an internal and external effect on those around us. For example, you might not think that your individual actions or small acts of ignorance can later influence or cause a huge mental burden upon thousands for years to come, but even so, the effects of violence, while sometimes invisible, are still ever present. And that's why it's important not to upload jump scares of Michael Jackson to YouTube for fun. Cause you never know when some 10-year-old is gonna stumble across it and get traumatized to the extent that they, over a decade later, added an entire segment discussing it to their multi-hour long video that's supposed to be about Asian hate crimes. However, to provide some hope beyond the previous doom and gloom, the MJ jump scare really isn't that bad watching it back as an adult now, and it does seem that Asian hate crimes against Asian Americans have begun to notice a downward trend, as for the first time in 3 years, Asian American hate crimes have dropped from a peak of 746 cases in 2021 to 499 cases in 2022. That said, despite a notable decrease in anti-Asian hate crimes, it should also be noted that these changes would not signify that the actions against hate crimes are no longer necessary. Moreover, in spite of a decrease in Asian hate crimes, we can still see that Asian hate crimes are significantly larger than amounts seen pre-pandemic, with the amount of Asian hate crimes in 2022 being over 2 times the amount seen in 2020 and over 3 times higher than the cases reported during 2019. Thus, it's hard to refute that the lasting impacts of COVID towards shifting perceptions of Asian American to yellow peril still hasn't carried through. In fact, I'd go as far as to claim that we probably won't be seeing a return to tradition anytime soon for the role of Asian Americans as a marginalized community. Because once the cat's out of the bag, it's not so easy to put that sucker back in anymore. And with the floodgates released and Asian consciousness towards our position and role in the country ever increasing, I doubt that we can continue to remain ignorant towards our contributions in a system of oppression. At least, I hope not. I mean, I know for a fact most Asian folks will still choose to remain ignorant, but that's kind of what this video is for. So, the gig is up. During the pandemic, we finally discovered that we've been secretly thought of as yellow perils this entire time. In fact, we weren't just some model minority slowly ascending out of chink status with every new doctor and lawyer. We've always been bastardly Chinamen, no more now than we were previously. Well, what then? How did we respond to it? Unfortunately, some of the responses to this revelation weren't really the best. Like a goggling-eyed boomer sitting crazed in front of a casino in Las Vegas, squandering the wealth they attained from a period of economic opportunity unavailable to those currently. When one tends to lose that of which they once owned, their initial gut reaction is typically attempts towards regaining what they had prior. Unfortunately, in the example of gambling, that doesn't really turn out the best. And in the same facet, with a fair amount of Asian American responses, those didn't go so well either. A fervent example of this failure can be seen in the response given by model minority glazed king himself, Andrew Yang. A businessman and later politician, Andrew Yang, who ran in the Democratic primary, had a unique chance to represent Asian Americans at the forefront of politics. And while he was unsuccessful in his attempts to win the bid for presidential candidacy, what he did accomplish was clown the fuck out of us. Basically, when shit hit the fan for Asian peeps during peak Coco-19, the homie's response to the increase in Asian hate across America wasn't denouncing or reprimanding such acts. In fact, he outright admits that he didn't think this was the right action to take, but instead, for Asian Americans to go out and take accountability, proving their Americanness and that they're not a virus. I mean, you literally cannot make this shit up, dude. The fact that I even have to discuss why Asian Americans are undeserving of getting attacked for features that they were given at birth and shouldn't have to prove themselves to avoid violence is insane. And if any of y'all are hearing this for the first time or find yourselves a little suspect towards how I'm interpreting his stance, I implore you to actually go and read his op-ed he wrote responding to Asian hate. The article is super short and I'll link it in the description below, so you don't have to take my word for it, y'all can read Yang's words yourself. And by the way, if anyone is watching this video and happens to be a Democrat or Republican big shot and would like me to make a hit video on Andrew Yang that will actually get his 2 largest voter bases, being Asian Americans and liberals, to not vote for him, please kindly organize a super PAC and transfer me a small donation of at least 10k or more. Price will determine video quality, but I'm willing to negotiate. Unfortunately, the reaction didn't just come from Yang. In fact, this was pretty much the typical Asian response, which was attempts at trying to be a better minority group rather than realize that no minority group can be or should ever want to be known as the good minorities. As disappointing as that might be, most Asians did in fact get on their knees sucking off our political overlords, while in the same vein turning around and looking down on other Asian Americans for not getting their act together and playing their role as model minority better, especially if they didn't want to get beat in the streets. And I don't know y'all, but if some person was enacting actual violence upon me, my first reaction wouldn't be to apologize for not being good enough and trying to better please them in hopes that they don't attack me again in the future. In fact, I'd throw hands. So I really don't understand why this still needs to be said, but just as getting robbed shouldn't mean that it was your fault for getting robbed, or getting attacked being your responsibility for not being able to better defend yourselves, women shouldn't be leered at for wearing revealing clothes, queer peeps shouldn't be berated for being openly queer, and racial minorities who have been victim of racism shouldn't be blamed for being born a racial minority. Low-key, I'd say it louder for the peeps in the back, but I literally shouldn't have to say... Ah! Now, hopefully, After how long of a section this video has already been, I don't have to explain why trying to subscribe to the role of model minority again isn't helpful, in the same way that I hope I don't have to explain why gambling and continuing to gamble after losing is also a bad idea. And as the stats I showed earlier express, Asian hate crimes against Asian Americans are still trending when compared to pre-pandemic. So while I can't do coverage of specific examples justice without adding another hour to this video, there are multiple notable cases of Asian hate crimes that have been committed post-lockdown that I'll post on screen and in the description. Hello, post-production Angry Frog Dude here. After writing and reviewing the script, I noticed that I didn't explicitly denounce Asian hate crimes. Obviously, while this video is more concerned on the narratives behind Asian hate crimes and the perpetrators behind them, it's still linked to the subject of Asian hate overall. So while this shouldn't have to be said, I'ma just say it anyway in case it wasn't clear throughout this video. Asian hate crimes are bad, and people should not commit hate crimes or any other form of violence or discrimination against Asian Americans or any other ethnic minority. Okay, great, let's carry on. You may also be questioning if we tried anything else, and yeah, we kinda did. But not gonna lie, this other strat was likely even worse than what the Yang Gang cooked up, and that plan was a little something known as the blame game. Now, I can already hear some of y'all being like, holy shit, is he finally gonna address the title of this video? Yes, I'm finally going to talk about the song Black and Yellow by Wiz Khalifa. And the reason why doing a deep dive on Wiz Khalifa's Black and Yellow proves essential towards... So, with failing to retain the model minority status that Asian Americans were taught they had intrinsically possessed throughout their upbringing, a lot of Asian Americans descended into the 5 stages of grief. Some simply denied it and continued living as if Asian people weren't getting hate crimed across the nation. Some tried to bargain with others to regain their status as model minority. We all know how that went. Some grew depressed and attempted to separate themselves from American identity in general. But for the most part, they failed to accept that yes, they are in fact the perilous yellow man the country now viewed them as. However, for those of y'all who have been paying close attention and don't consume video essays in the background while doing other tasks like myself, you'll notice that I skipped a stage. Anger, the period between denial and bargaining. And for a lot of Asian Americans, playing the blame game and settling on anger was a real easy cop-out compared to acknowledging the reality around them. And with America being deeply entrenched in structures of anti-blackness, who would have been easier to blame for the grievances of Asian Americans than black people? That's right, it was Wiz Khalifa's fault that Asian people in America have been getting attacked. He was the unspoken person behind it the entire time. But jokes aside, it's no secret that blaming the black community was an actual response taken by a large sum of Asian Americans. So while the professional media didn't cover it, the online realm certainly did, and that stuff is still happening today. Now, before I can continue further on covering the blame game as it's happening currently, I do want to apologize for doing this to y'all again. As much as I said I wanted to keep this video concise and not spend time going over individual cases of Asian violence or mulling too long in the past, I do need to cover what happened in Los Angeles in 1992 to flesh out the stuff happening today. But look, y'all clicked on this video for a reason. No sane person clicks on a multi-hour long video essay not wanting to hear a person yap for ages. So don't front all of a sudden and pretend like you would have preferred a short review of a Wiz Khalifa song instead. Y'all wanted me to cover the LA Civil Uprising. You just didn't know it yet. So that's what you're gonna get. Getting into it, while it might initially seem that the current narratives about conflict between yellow, brown, and black communities spawned after hate crimes profuse and violence against Asian Americans skyrocketed during COVID, if we take a little step back, we can see that this perspective isn't historically novel. Rewinding the clock about 30 years ago, which is pretty recent considering it's only been 5 years since the start of the pandemic, some of y'all might remember or have even been around for the LA Civil Uprising. And during that event, the narratives of violence between minorities then seemed eerily similar to the ones of today. As a side tangent, while doing research for this video, I got sidetracked and stumbled upon an interesting tidbit about both Biden and Trump. Apparently, both of these mofos existed well before segregation ended, and they're really out here trying to have us believe that racism somehow disappeared after Obama was elected. In fact, the homie Biden was in his literal 20s, and Trump was a full-on adult before the country agreed that separating people by race was some fuck shit. Knowing all that now, ain't no way some of y'all really believe we live in a post-racism world where our past two presidents were raised during a period in culture when they legit thought marginalized groups unworthy to drink the same water as others. Tangent aside, the LA civil uprising was a conflict between marginalized communities where violence and civil protests broke out after quick successions of racial injustices. Primarily, this event proliferated in south-central LA where the population involved were mostly composed of Hispanic, Korean, and Black Americans. But for this specific example, the primary tensions existed between Black and Asian communities, and the event kicked off with the occurrence of a single tragedy, the beating of Rodney King. On an early Sunday morning in March 3, 1991, Rodney King and two friends were driving around the freeway after a night of watching basketball and drinking. Under the influence, King's vehicle would eventually pass a police car, and noticing that King had been speeding, the officer would eventually follow. Fearful of getting charged, Rodney King decided an attempt at outrunning the officer, leading to a full-blown police chase, concluding with King's car getting cut off and the passengers of the vehicle apprehended. However, rather than simply arrest King, the officer decided to rough up the passengers, assaulting each one in the process of getting them to the ground. And later, this would escalate further as they not only tased Rodney King, but proceeded to kick and beat him with their batons as he huddled defenseless. Respondingly, outrage ensued, and while the four officers who attacked King and his passengers would not initially face any charges, they would later be tried for their actions due to footage of the events being captured by a present bystander. But the outrage at the events wasn't simply because of the assault on King. You see, police brutality and racial violence in policing has always been a thing. The footage and coverage of the events that occurred to Rodney King were simply confirmation. Not confirmation that the police brutality occurred, as members of the Black community had long been aware of the unjust violence enacted upon them by cops, but confirmation that even with the ugly reality of police brutality revealed at the national stage, people would still continue to deny and refuse any acknowledgement of its occurrence, refusing to validate that Black Americans were deserving not just of equality, but justice. Strike one. Now, while the tragedy that befell Rodney King was the linchpin behind the uprising, it should be understood that it wasn't just a singular incident that triggered the LA civil uprising, but more so a slow buildup of tension over decades that finally exploded after several events. In fact, just 13 days after the brutal beating of King, another harm against a member of the Black community took place, this time involving the death of a 15-year-old girl, Latasha Harlins. However, unlike with King, this event didn't involve an actor of the state, but a member coexisting with the Black community of LA, Sunja Do, a Korean American. Before covering the death of Harlins further, it's important to be aware of the context and backdrop behind Korean and Black Americans surrounding the event. While Black people made up the largest segment of the marginalized community in LA at the time, Asian Americans, specifically Koreans, also took up a decent chunk of the populace. Notably, after the floodgates of Asian immigration opened after the passing of the 1952 Walter McCarran Act, which finally did away with anti-Asian exclusion laws, many immigrants from Asia hoped to settle within America to start for themselves a better life. In particular, Korean immigrants settled within South Central LA and attempted to make a life in coexistence with other marginalized communities alongside them. After arriving, many Korean Americans used their savings from their country of origin to open up small businesses, such as liquor stores and corner stores. And unbeknownst to these immigrants, these actions will eventually set them in opposition against the Black community that had settled prior. You see, Black-owned businesses had already existed and dealt with their fair share of injustices in South Central LA well before the arrival of Korean Americans. And to make themselves capital, Korean store owners by necessity had to compete against and undercut Black businesses to succeed. And in successfully doing so, Korean Americans were touted as a paragon for other marginalized groups able to make a life for themselves despite novel citizenship through hard work, unlike the respective Black and Hispanic communities that had gotten outcompeted despite existing there prior. And if y'all have been paying attention, you'll probably be like, whoa, I think I've heard something like this before. Yeah, you did. This is where all the work I did earlier explaining the model minority myth in part 1 finally ties itself back into the story. Y'all probably thought I was yapping just to yap, didn't you? But in talking as much as I did earlier about how the model minority myth hurts other marginalized groups, now, instead of just theory, I can give y'all examples of how it worked in practice. Knowing the backdrop of how Korean Americans immigrated to the US, it makes sense that in a system of racism, any success they attained would inevitably be leveraged against other ethnic groups, while if they had failed, it would have been used as a claim that minorities are simply inferior. And with Korean American success undercutting black businesses and stealing capital from the already downtrodden community, it's unsurprising that resentment against Korean Americans built over time. While in the same facet, Korean Americans would begin believing narratives of Asian exceptionalism and looking down on surrounding marginalized groups that they had been profiting from.
How could they do this to us? I was disappointed within African Americans. I used to hate black people. I see my parents are working so hard. We should never do business in a black neighborhood.
Moreover, with the majority of Korean-owned businesses being in South LA composed of liquor and convenience stores known for selling junk food, cigarettes, alcohol, and a slew of other vices, it would be hard to claim that the Korean businesses gave back to the community rather than reinvested their profits into Korean communities at a cost of black and Hispanic ones. Especially since Korean Americans could only afford to run smaller family-owned businesses, causing criticism for their lack of employment of black workers who they primarily did business with.
Korean merchants had utter contempt for black clients. They took money from the community and put nothing into the community. They did not defer to blacks as clientele, as customers. The money, the change thrown to them. No eye contact, no greetings, no thank you. It is as if I am doing you a favor by having a store in your communities.
However, while it might be easy to take that notion at face value and believe the sentiment to hold veracity, it should also be noted that operating under such logics that Korean Americans simply stole from the marginalized communities of South LA means internalizing that they can never be part of the marginalized struggles, and sows further foreignization of Asian Americans and communal division. What I'm trying to say is that both communities were facing their own unique struggles, and there were valid criticisms from either side during the uprising. Basically, the issue wasn't black and white, it was black and yellow. So, with the backdrop out of the way, how does this tie into the murder of Latasha Harlins? Well, it just so happens that the event of Harlan's death took place in a liquor store owned by none other than Korean American Sun Ja-do. On March 16th of 1991, a 15-year-old girl by the name of Latasha Harlins walked into a couple-owned liquor store run by Sun Ja-do and her husband. While her husband was absent at the time, Do was operating the store from the back of her counter. Meanwhile, Harlins, in a rush at the time, quickly perused the aisles looking for a beverage. After attaining a container of juice and putting it in her backpack, when she walked to the register to pay with money in hand, Sun Ja-do mistakenly thought that she did not possess any money and had intended to steal from the store. Acting upon her suspicions, Ja-do sprung into action, grabbing Harlins by the sweater and attempting to take her backpack. In retaliation, Latasha Harlins struck Do repeatedly and knocked her to the ground. Attempting to remove herself from the situation, Harlins would then turn to leave the store, but just as she had turned and began to leave, Ja-do, rising from the ground, grabbed the revolver hidden behind the counter and shot Harlins in the back of the head, killing her on the spot. And after hearing the sound of the gunshot, Sun Ja-do's husband would soon arrive at the scene, later dialing the police to report the incident. Months following the event of Harlan's murder, on November 15th of 1991, after multiple investigations and legal proceedings, the case finally made its way into the courts. And while Sun Ja-do would claim that she acted in self-defense, akin to the police in the situation involving King earlier, the death of Latasha Harlins had fortunately been caught on tape. This time not via bystander, but by Sun Ja-do's own security footage taken from a camera positioned at the corner edge of her store. Thus, with video evidence of Harlins attempting to de-escalate and flee the scene before Ja-do took action, Do's testimony of self-defense soon fell to shambles, and in having access to forensic reports, eyewitness accounts, and even tangible film depicting the tragic events that had occurred, all jurors would come to a unanimous decision that Sun Ja-do was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter. That said, although the decision was conclusive, if you haven't learned from the incident befalling Rodney King prior, members of the black community don't often get the justice that they so deserve. And despite the charge of voluntary manslaughter carrying a maximum sentence of 16 years in prison, Do would be sentenced instead to 10 years suspended, 5 years probation, 400 hours of community service, and a mere $500 fine along with the cost of Harlan's funeral. By the way, for those of you unaware, a suspended sentence is basically a period of time where someone only goes to jail if they're found guilty of committing another crime. So basically, in the case of Sunja-do, as long as she didn't commit another crime during the 5-year probation period, she effectively would face 0 prison time for the murder of Harlins. And while I don't support the idea of carceral punishment, if you took a comparable look at examples of voluntary manslaughter for the time with people who were found guilty of those charges commonly faced, you gotta admit that the decision was basically a slap on the wrist. As such, following a court verdict in a similar fashion to the events after the attack on King, outrage ensued. Cries of inequality and injustice spread throughout Los Angeles, and the anger and despair within the black community was palpable. But this time, not only over the inequality of the criminal justice system or the unfairness of the system overhead, but also a fury towards Asian Americans that had been harbored in building and pressure since Korean Americans began settling in LA.
She got away with murder.
I damn sure hope so, that there would be all the hell in the black community.
Somebody would care.
Stand up and see this insanity for exactly what it is. Black people once again being unjustly treated by the I mean, you can have a black person killed with a video with eyewitnesses, and this is what you'll get.
Some blacks see the Koreans as a merchant class that takes advantage of the black community.
Why don't you open a market that we can use for our family?
Go back to Korea.
You're not business. We want business.
The case has become a symbol of tensions between 2 large groups in this ethnically diverse city.
You see, Latasha Harlins wasn't just any other victim to anti-blackness and violence. She was a symbol representing the future. More than being just an innocent girl with her whole life ahead of her, Latasha Harlins was also an honor roll student, an outstanding member of the black community who had aspirations of becoming a lawyer and a beacon signifying that black people in America could still thrive despite multitudes of racial structures and roadblocks used against them.
Latasha was an A student, honor roll student. She got money every week for her allowance, so she did not have to steal orange juice.
In essence, Harlins wasn't just a child, but quite literally the embodiment of black excellence, killed no less than by a member of the Asian community, long touted for their academic achievements and utilized for the purpose of shaming black Americans as lazy and dim. Therefore, it was clear as day that Asian labor and black efforts were not valued the same, for even if a black person had managed to perform the unachievable standards that Asian model minorities were held to, they would still not be guaranteed any semblance of justice in America. Strike 2. But even after the beating of Rodney King, the death of Latasha Harlins, and the court verdict for Sunja-do, there was still a glimmer of hope, a small thread of doubt that the system might not be rigged against black Americans. However, all optimism died a few months later in 1992, because on April 29th, a little over a year after the police brutality experienced by Rodney King, the 4 cops who had participated in the attack on King would find themselves facing trial just as Sunja-do before them. However, while similar to how Do's case played out, this time the verdict didn't just result in the comparable lack of proper judgment, but the downright absence of it. Because even despite possessing video evidence documenting the unjustified attack of an unarmed king, a jury, after 7 days of deliberation, still made the decision to acquit all 4 officers of any charges levied against them with regards to the assault.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Lawrence M. Powell not guilty of the crime of assault by force likely to produce great bodily injury and with a deadly weapon. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Timothy E. Wind not guilty. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Theodore J. Brasino not guilty. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Stacy C. Kuhn not guilty. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, are these your verdicts? So say you one, so say you all.
Yes.
And not only did the jury and multiple trial attorneys refuse to acknowledge the role that King's race played in the attacks, but each and every member involved in reaching the verdict watched the very same film of Rodney King being struck upwards of 50 times repeatedly and arrived at the conclusion that neither excessive nor unlawful force was utilized. Thus, as history is repeated, outrage followed soon after, but this time it wouldn't just be verbal expressions of turmoil and suffering. After all, as the rule goes, you get 3 strikes and you're out, and the word out was an understatement. Being forced to come to grips that black Americans had existed in a reality that would never allow them to attain the justice or resources that others could attain within the United States, it makes sense that some would instead decide to take to the streets to voice their concerns. Following immediately after the acquittal of the 4 officers who had assaulted King, organized protests and upheaval spread throughout South Central LA.
I'm angry, but I'm not surprised. For over 400 years, our people have suffered not only civil rights, but the right to be a human being. One of our brothers has been unjustly beaten, and it has been justified by a jury that shows us that we can't get justice in America. How many more Rodney Kings does it have to be? How many more Latasha Harlins does it have to be?
With the momentum propelling the uprising throughout the city, by April 30th, the day after King's attackers had been acquitted, the uprising had reached full velocity within Koreatown. And in tandem with the protesters, while the initiative was originally a coordinated and collective effort, eventually, many others with differing motivations joined the tide, and looting among arson occurred as the opportunity presented itself during the chaos of civil rebellion. Directing their malice at the very buildings and structures that they had been prohibited employment from, whether due in part to a lack of wealth, opportunity, or downright discrimination, protesters and looters in the marginalized community as a whole began making their generational anger known. And while the LA Police Department, the Sheriff's Department, Fire Department, and the National Guard were all called into service as a response, Koreatown would soon be ablaze. Even though Korean Americans and governing representatives of LA had called for the combined support of the government and the state, the police and security turnout that appeared were less than desirable. Noting scarce protection and the small amount of police who did show up would often flee at the first sign of violence, Korean Americans left to their own devices felt they had no choice but to self-mobilize. And to understand why this decision was made, it's necessary to draw back on the context provided earlier. While Korean Americans were touted as a model minority, the only thing that separated them from any other marginalized group was their financial standing. After all, while they may have had more wealth than the Black and Hispanic communities that they resided in the same areas, grew up in the same neighborhoods, and received the same education as, many Korean Americans were only able to open their businesses as a result of pooling their savings prior to immigrations. Thus, their stores were not just their jobs, but also their livelihoods. As such, with the lack of aid from law enforcement, the Korean Americans felt that they had no choice besides putting their lives on the line. Thankfully, for the Korean Americans, many immigrants had experience in using weapons and performing military operations. After all, South Korea has a requirement of mandatory military service for all of its men. And with many already owning firearms as a result of prejudice against other marginalized groups in South LA, buying into the American narratives that Black and Hispanic Americans were more likely to be thugs and criminals, the Korean Americans took to the roofs to defend their businesses. Calling on the aid of other Korean Americans in the community, the store owners and young organized to arm each other and protect their financial assets. Whether that be through standing in front of their shops and firing blanks to scare away potential looters, or nesting themselves on roofs to rain bullets at probable arsonists, the Korean Americans formed collective measures to protect their wealth and status. However, despite an admirable effort, much of LA's Koreatown would not come out unscathed, and not only in regards to protecting their stores and businesses, but also with the lives of their youth. One such death occurring at the initial wave of the upheaval that reached Koreatown was a tragedy that befell Eddie Song Lee, aged 18, on the same day that the uprising had reached the Koreans. Living with his two parents and his sister, Lee, after hearing of the damages across the ethnic enclave, felt obligated to help his fellow Korean Americans of his community. Heading out of his home in the heart of the uprising, as many young Koreans did similarly, Eddie Song Lee was determined to aid in shielding Korean-owned businesses from potential damages. But by the morning after, Eddie Lee did not return home. Waiting for their reunion, his mother remained hopeful that he may have stayed with a friend, but all hope diminished when she later saw the news. In a local newspaper, she saw pictures reporting a death that occurred in a Korean store, and in the picture lay a still body on the street. As she recounts herself,
딸이 엄마 오빠 이상하게 뭐가 어떻게 됐나 봐 그러더니 막 울어요. 어저께 원산연합에서 있었던 게 얘기가 돼요. 그래 그날 한국인보에 나와서 한국 사람이 첫 생자 해가지고 그래서 이게 내 아들이 아니겠지. 얼굴은 분명히 내 아들인데 옷이 아니니까 얘가 그 사이에 한 게 제가 그 당시에 그러면 지금 얘가 있는 데가 어디냐 그래도 시체 안치소에 있다고 그러더라고.
Despite recognizing the face of her child, her mind refused to acknowledge that he had passed. She told herself that maybe it was just someone who resembled her son. After all, Lee's shirt was white when he had left their home, not the dark color shown in the pictures. However, when another news tabloid later released the same picture in full color, she understood that the shirt wasn't black, but stained red with blood. Eddie Song Lee had died on April 30th, 1992, shot by the owner of the same business he had tried to protect, mistaking the young man as one of the looters. Thus, the Korean Americans wept, not just for the victims of their community, but for the loss of their houses, careers, and livelihoods. So, by the 4th and 5th day of the insurgents, when tensions had died down, thousands of federal troops took military occupation of the city, and by the end of the uprising, thousands of buildings, around billions of dollars, were either lost or destroyed. And still, to this day, the LA Civil Uprising remains the single most expensive centralized uprising in United States history. But the loss wasn't just as it seemed. Towards the conclusion of the uprising, the damage was visible, not just to Korean Americans who took the brunt of the financial and commercial loss, but also to many Black Americans who had suffered the loss of many businesses and lives. After all, while the communities may have had their gripes with one another, they were both still marginalized groups from the same area. And so, despite the initial cause of the uprising being to protest to resolve injustice and to voice the sufferings of countless oppressions towards the Black community of South Central LA, the lootings and arsons from opportunists were recognized as having having escalated a step too far. And on May 1st, the day before the military occupation, Rodney King publicly appeared to appeal for peace, resonating with thousands of voices in both the Korean and Black community.
I just want to say, can we all get along? Please, we can get along here. Let's try to work it out.
You see, though the uprising made the anger and suffering of the marginalized known, and King would eventually get some justice in courts after the protests, it potentially hurt the community more than it aided them. And not because protesting is bad. In fact, standing on business to vocalize issues that affect you is a good thing. But that doesn't mean that while you may support a movement, you should also condone any potential looting, arson, or violence that took place. But to be fair, it's not like you can really blame the protesters for it. In any uprising or mass movement, there's bound to be some degree of bad actors and people unaffiliated who take advantage of opportunities to profit or incite mayhem. So at the end of the day, issues of equity and the uprising are still complicated. While there may be those that argue there are certainly healthier ways to cope through anger and suffering, and while they may be right, it's hard to say that there are universal methods with which every marginalized body in America can peacefully combat oppression. And if I'm just gonna be real, if you don't have experiences being treated unjustly as a minority, then it's probably easy for you to just tell us that we should find better ways of fighting racism than throwing hands, especially if the hands being thrown may potentially clip you. I mean, if the system causing you and others like you harm for centuries has continually done so without stop, is going to therapy or meditating really going to make the violence stop? Like, those activities are cool and all for relieving stress, but what if your issue isn't stress itself, but the big back motherfucker named Tony who keeps stealing your cookies and stressing you out? While backhanding them probably isn't a solution to all bullying, you gotta admit that you can't just let someone continue to bully you, especially if you're gonna start telling the person being bullied to be a bigger person and to just deal with the situation on their own without the bully ever being held accountable or facing any repercussions for their harms. So, with that said, following the uprising, the message was clear. The oppressed and marginalized demanded that something be done to grant them justice and equality, and if that didn't happen, well...
The August riots may be only a curtain raiser to what could blow up one day in the future.
We finally made it to the future. No more long video segments about historical events. Now, thankfully, I can keep the context for the COVID era section a bit short because for the most part, the same racial undertones and issues between Asian Americans and the Black community still exist today. But also, because the slew of uprisings that occurred during the pandemic were neither centralized nor focused mainly between Asians and Black Americans. That said, the death of George Floyd at the hands of the police, especially with the presence of an Asian cop in attendance, definitely reflects certain issues reminiscent of 1992. However, I'd argue that the Asian police's involvement was probably more symbolic of how Asian Americans tend to stand idle during historical acts of anti-Blackness compared to more tangible conflicts between the two groups. And also, y'all are gonna have to give me some leeway, cause 2019 happened during my edgy teen conservative phase, so it's hard for me to recall correctly whether the death of Floyd was outwardly racially motivated more so than an act of police misconduct. But I'm sure it played a role subconsciously in the minds of the officers, especially with Chauvin's known track record of having multiple complaints filed against him. In fact, if I had the same knowledge in frontal lobe development then as I do now, I could probably find some hidden angle explaining why the event was not just subconsciously racist, but an outright act of anti-Blackness, which it probably was. And the more that I think about it, the more my mind starts leaning towards officers dehumanizing Black people and viewing them as subhuman while in uniform, but I can't really be arsed to research and recontextualize all that and massively derailing from the topic. And if that doesn't satisfy y'all, well, then that sucks. I already lived through this, and the COVID era has very much recently ended, if it still isn't in the process of fully clearing, so I'm not trying to research context or events that haven't fully unfolded or been allowed to marinate with history yet. Basically, I'm like my dad and his experience as a child refugee. I'm trying to avoid opening that can of worms as much as possible. I'm tired of COVID, and y'all probably are too, so I ain't going into depth about it, like, for at least half a decade or something. I don't know. Regardless, here's the brief summary. COVID-19 spread from Wuhan, China to China and Asia generally, and then when it got into the US, it was pandemonium all over the place, especially regarding protests. I mean, you had Asian Americans getting attacked in the streets and the Stop Asian Hate movements that kinda got a little attention, but then got fucking ignored. And then it was followed by the BLM protest proceedings and the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. You also had Antifa stuff going on and general riots and looting, as well as the declaration of the Chaz Autonomous Zone, while at the same time dealing with the proliferation of anti-vaxxers and COVID deniers, followed by the cherry on top with the insurrection on January 6th. Basically, it was a literal shit show and COVID era sucked. So, in lieu of doing a disservice of covering it all and me being lazy as hell, I'ma just quickly summarize the relationships between Asia, America, and the black community, and then we can get into the racial narratives and statistics regarding black on Asian hate crimes, which is what y'all were really here for anyway. As mentioned earlier, the underlying social issues and conflicts between the black and Asian communities haven't really changed much since 1992. In fact, although I didn't exist then, I'd probably wager to bet that if anything, up until the occurrence of Coco-19, Asian Americans have moved even further in towards adopting their status as model minority. Guess the people in the LA civil uprising suffered for nothing. So, unsurprisingly, the ignorance and general lack of unity between the two groups hasn't changed much, and after COVID broke out, Asian Americans fell victim to being blamed for a virus that originated from a continent that they no longer had any connections to. Of course, we already covered how the Yang Gang and most Asian Americans responded, but a lot of yellow and brown peeps also chose to publicly protest and loudly exclaim the mantra of Stop Asian Hate. But if we're gonna be real, people didn't really care and the movement didn't gain much traction, especially after the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, where the BLM movement was picking up steam. After all, in the eyes of the general public, the BLM movement was the real race movement that liberals could get behind. I mean, kneeling with a kente scarf and posting black scares on Instagram is super cool and anti-racist. Don't you want to be cool and anti-racist? And Asian Americans, well, they're financially well off anyway. Never mind that there are huge financial discrepancies between East, Southeast, and South Asians. But on a serious note, we aren't all balling like East Asians, and even though a large wealth difference between different Asian ethnicities exists, it doesn't really matter because Asian Americans are generally seen as politically inactive and impervious to oppression via hard work, while Black Americans are a larger minority population that are occasionally stereotyped as victims who contribute to a large chunk of the Democratic voter base in need of some white saviorism and political guidance. And thus, Stop Asian Hate kinda never caught fire, while the BLM movement continued to snowball until its more radical motivations eventually got co-opted by liberals and fizzled out. By the way, it should be noted that while none of the cases like Floyd, Taylor, and even King are ever black and white, cause perfect victims don't exist in reality, none of that justifies getting killed. Being under the influence or running away from the police does not justify getting brutally beaten or choked to death, and that's the crux of the issue. Committing a crime or being suspected of one does not render an individual of their humanity and right to life. So instead of devolving into frivolous debates over the details of each case and caring more about winning arguments over whether the victim of police violence was a guilty criminal or not, why don't we all just agree that people shouldn't be fucking slaughtered by the police? Like, bruh, come on. Even if you support capital punishment, you gotta admit that it should be decided in court rather than getting brutally executed on the spot during an arrest. Regardless of criminality, every victim of police brutality are still people. They had families, friends, loved ones, and dreams, and they all deserve better than to have been killed or commodified or used for some crappy one-liner to own a political opponent. Humanizing others should not be hard. It shouldn't have to start with death, so regardless of color, wealth, ability, age, or any other thing, we should seek to understand and help one another. Thankfully, some members of both the Asian and Black communities in America could see through the divisional bullshit during COVID and decided to cooperate in solidarity. After all, both understood the oppression of being marginalized and the struggles in being stereotyped. Black Americans had long been aware of this dynamic, and some Asian Americans had just started to wake up once transitioning from model minority to yellow peril. I mean, the threat of getting beat in the streets, regardless of how well you fit into a role of model minority, is a wake-up call and a half. And obviously, most Asian Americans aren't exactly woke yet, but enough awareness has been made between the two groups to collectively cooperate. Unfortunately, despite Black Americans supporting Stop Asian Hate and Asian Americans supporting the BLM protests, solidarity didn't last long. You see, while they could relate to struggles of marginalization, the two groups fundamentally disagreed on what should be done with policing. Obviously, the Black community had long dealt with the brunt of the violence enacted by the Pig Squad, and with the same system that brutalized King having killed Floyd and Taylor, it was clear that policing was ineffective. However, much like the Korean American community in South Central LA, Asian Americans in aggregate possess much more wealth and financial assets than other minority groups, so the older heads of the Asian community, or the old heads derogative, supported policing as a way to protect their wealth, and as a countermeasure to protect their dusty asses from Asian hate crimes. After all, if you're afraid of individual attackers, just support the biggest thug group known to man. Of course, it should be noted that younger Asians in solidarity with the Black community were much more receptive towards being against policing, and for good reasons. Not getting too into the weeds, it's important to know that while East Asians died via police police violence at a rate less than a third of Southeast Asians, Pacific Islanders suffered higher rates on par with Native and Black Americans. So obviously, despite being viewed as a monolith, Asian Americans as a whole aren't really treated as such. And if you look into it a little bit, you'll notice that a lot of police in places traditionally believed to benefit us kind of fall apart once you look at how it affects us beyond overarching racial lumpings. But considering filial piety and Asian cultural indoctrination about deferring to your elders, their preference of policing stayed as the old heads are still on top, which is proof that boomers ruin everything, obviously. But with all that having gone down, here we are now. Nothing prevalent has really occurred with police reform, and the conservatives have even used examples of bad policing to argue that investing more funding into a larger and more vigorously trained police state will stop bad cops from doing crappy things. But maybe it's not the lack of funding or training that enables racists to be racist, but the system itself. For example, while a fireplace worked for some in the past, you can't really say that's the best choice of heating for most households today. And if your fireplace is broken and outdated and you're in need of heating, you don't just keep throwing money into repairing the cracks and upgrading the fireplace so it's optimized to burn better. Sometimes you just need to replace that shit with a heating unit. And it's not like we don't have the money. America is literally the richest country in the world, so how are we getting outdone by other countries in regards to dealing with heating insulation? Maybe throwing money at something in capitalism doesn't always lead to the best outcomes. But look, this isn't gonna spiral into a full-blown video about why American policing sucks. Y'all should watch this FD signifier video for a breakdown instead. But what this video will do is shed some light on anti-Asian hate crimes, and as of currently, the outlook is kind of grim. Anti-Blackness is still as prevalent as ever, and the anti-Asian hate over the past couple years has been as high as ever. The only question is how these two issues intersect with one another and who's really behind the new cases of anti-Asian hate. Well, if you're as chronically online as me, and recall racial tensions covered during the LA Civil Uprising and notice social medias over the past few years blaming a certain group for the increase in Asian hate crimes, your first suspicion might be that Black people have been the ones behind it. So, with everything I've said prior, it probably sounds like I'm about to contribute to minority on minority violence and unleash the most anti-Black tangent known to the dinosaurs, blaming Black people for the explosion of anti-Asian hate that occurred since the pandemic. But as I said in the intro, this isn't going to be a video shitting on Black people. I mean, y'all already know there's enough of that content floating around YouTube. So, keeping that in mind, let's dive into the popular narrative and dissect the racial breakdown of stats for Asian hate crimes. I'm writing this part of the script right now as I just finished part 3, and after rereading the transition from part 2 to 3 in order to get some inspo for how I want to start part 4 off, I just realized I alluded to getting into the blame game at the end of part 2 just to barely address it before blueballing y'all with an entire part 3 about the historical context behind Asian and Black race issues. My bad, y'all. The OG outline had this part as the second half of part 3, but then I realized that this section would have been way too long and that it'd be better to cover the topic separately, so that's why we're here now. The point is, even though it took a while, I'm keeping good on my word. Basically, as a short refresher, while failing to regain the model minority status and being forced into the role of Yellow Peril, rather than attempt to understand and combat the perceptions and racism against us, Asian Americans decided to double down and give it to the next minority, which then took Praxis in the form of spreading anti-Blackness. I mean, this formula is literally a tried and true method of coping with oppression in a harmful way. Just like how poor white people in the past used to support segregation and racism to feel better about themselves, Asian peeps today seem to be buying into the narrative of anti-Blackness to feel better about getting beat in the streets. So, I guess it's easier to continue oppressing other marginalized groups to feel like you're not the lowest rung of the pecking order instead of punching up, especially if you don't care about spreading more violence and reinforcing the systems that keeps you down. I mean, trickle-down violence is truly one of the forms of violence of all time, but so is blaming others. As I wondered in part 3, I don't know how chronically online y'all are or if you've seen some of the narratives in action, but if we're gonna spend time disproving it, we might as well identify it first. By the way, shout out to Lance for sending me a TikTok video of the narrative in action blaming Black people for Asian hate crimes that finally triggered me enough to make this video. But ironically enough, the first TikTok that started the development of this video has now been nuked by the app. So, that said, although the post is long gone, I still have a few screenshots from it, as well as evidence from other things that are yet to be banished from the internet. And thanks to the power of Twitter and Elon Musk deciding to let the app turn into a lo-fi 4chan remix, I was able to access even more nuggets of the narrative in action. To avoid tackling every post individually and adding an additional hour of watch time, I'm just going to give y'all the Cliff Notes summary, talk a bit about the reactions and comments to such posts and how it works in tandem towards anti-blackness, and then unpack the message of the narrative itself. Diving initially into the posts themselves, you can see that they all have common trends. All of them confidently assert black people as the ones behind the animosity and violence towards Asian Americans, and some of them delve even further to the narrative by adding context that victims largely consist of the elderly and women, and that unspecified force who didn't want the truth coming out, that being the liberal media in conjunction with the black community, were responsible for killing the Stop Asian Hate movement. And if y'all think that's a pretty wild chain of conclusions, just wait until you see the comments and reactions. From reactions ranging to memes slandering black people as inherently impulsive and violent, to self-hating individuals asserting that black neighborhoods are ghettos that will rob anyone close, and Asian victims blaming them for getting hate crime because they supposedly brought it on themselves for spreading COVID, you have the whole laundry list of racist anti-minority vitriol. Plus, if that isn't enough to convince y'all of the harm that these narratives spread, here's a pic I managed to take of the comments left on the OG TikTok sent to me before it got nuked off the internet. Like, come on, y'all. That's just straight up slurs and racism. And there were dozens more comments just like it. I just didn't document them. And low-key, some of those comments would probably be considered straight up hate crimes if said in public within certain nations. So it should be more than apparent that these narratives aren't as innocent or as harmless as some unspoken truth. But are such portrayals of black attacks against Asians incentivizing racism, or are racists simply drawn to such beliefs? Probably both. And that's because that spreading false information is actually like proxy racism. If you want to be racist, but you don't have the balls to actually do some fuck shit and get arrested for it, potentially facing no repercussions because we all know how fair the justice system is, then you can just spread fake narratives that incite anger and violence online, watching the violence unfold from your phones, while claiming plausible deniability by saying stuff like, "I wasn't being racist, I was just trying to speak my truth." Even though your truth is apparently rooted in implications of black people being intrinsically impulsive and violent because they can't compete with Asians and other races due to genetic inferiority. And some of y'all might be questioning, did I just hear that right? Did homie really just say that a narrative blaming black Americans for Asian hate crimes is linked to viewing black people as genetically inferior? Yeah, I did. You see, I'm gonna let y'all in on a little secret about conservative perceptions of black Americans. While y'all were probably cringing at me earlier for admitting that I had a conservative phase, it actually proved pretty beneficial to understanding and calling out ignorant conservative beliefs once I finally got out. And here's an example of that. Basically, under conservatism, there's pretty much two lenses with which to view black people and their communities. Either one, you see them as culturally flawed, whether as a result of liberal policies making them overly reliant on government assistance and lazy, or anything else that can set them back that isn't slavery, Jim Crow laws, segregation, or any other obvious racist stuff, because obviously you can't concede that black Americans are deserving of reparations if you're a Republican. Or two, you simply view them as genetically inferior and subhuman. Apparently it's just as simple as that for outright racist. I mean, you'd think that peeps in group 2 would at least try to hide it, but I guess they don't need enough minority votes to turn them into Democrats. So, obviously we know that the narrative both incentivizes interactions from racists and suggests a racist implication. But what exactly is that implication? Well, since I myself am guilty of watching video essays at 2 times speed, and I want y'all to slow down and actually process what I'm saying, as a tribute to my background in policy debate and to save this video some time, I'ma just spread through this shit, so feel free to put it on 0.5 speed if y'all need to. Well, as the narrative goes, the media likes to avoid covering the news that might be negative towards the black community because liberal media is bad and the liberal media is woke and the liberal media likes pandering to minorities, and obviously because there's at least some footage out there displaying Asian Americans getting hate crime by black people. Clearly black Americans are the one behind the proliferation of Asian hate. After all, they hate Asians because they ain't financially or academically balling like them. So, because black people as a whole are culturally raised wrong, making them more likely to turn into a life of crime and gangbanging instead of pulling themselves up by the bootstraps and getting a real job, they take their anchor on Asian Americans, primarily those less able to defend themselves as an elderly women who prove that they can't just blame racism for everything and demand reparations, especially since Asian Americans as a yellow peril responsible for the China virus and attacking them validates all the black communities build up anchor and allows them to release their culturally learned ratchetness upon the only good minorities who just want to work hard and be upstanding citizens. And that's pretty much it. As a side note, I know what some of y'all who actually processed all that are about to say. Actually, didn't you say earlier that Asian Americans are yellow perils now? How can you claim they're still model minorities? Permutation do both, motherfucker. But yes, we're still seen as model minorities despite being yellow perils at the same time. If it's confusing, just think back to the musical record example and remember that both the A side and B side of a disc are still parts of the same record. And you can play whichever side best suits your preferences depending on your mood. In this case, if you want to downplay the struggles of other minorities, just play the A side or the model minority side. And if you're in the mood to take your anger out on some Chinamen because you think they're responsible for giving you the sniffles, then play the B side or the yellow peril side. Easy peasy, perfectly digestible. The point is, the narrative boils down to black people bad, black people mad. Clearly, black people beat and make Asian Americans sad. And that's pretty much the gist of it. Obviously, it sounds pretty stupid when you actually say all that ignorant crap out loud, and the leaps in logics that's required to actually justify why they think that black people would even commit anti-Asian hate crimes in the first place is also pretty wild, but the ignorant and downright racism behind the narrative's reasoning is never explicitly stated, so I thought that I might as well bring it to light and reveal how dumb it is. I mean, I know the spoken part of the narrative is basically just that black people are behind the majority of hate crimes against Asian Americans, but let's be honest, we all know why they're so prone to blaming the black community and how they came to those conclusions, since they usually spread the narrative without the inclusion of any evidence. Like, no cap, but me literally saying all this crap out loud probably makes more logical sense than what they'd actually come up with if they tried to take the time to flesh out their ignorant thoughts. So, with that said, what do the actual stats have to say about the black community's involvement in Asian hate crimes? Well, the stats don't say much, and not in a way that there aren't many statistics or data that's telling of a story, but in the way that the research doesn't explicitly tell a narrative of black people's hostility against Asian Americans being the predominant cause behind the proliferation of COVID and post-COVID era Asian hate. Going to the data provided by the National Incident-Based Reporting Systems research interpreted in the paper Hate Crimes Against Asian Americans. No idea why the word against isn't capitalized in the title, by the way. I'm pretty sure the reason why the narrative spread that black people were behind the majority of Asian hate crimes is because the data suggests that, compared to the hate crimes against African Americans, hate crimes against Asian Americans are more likely to be committed by non-white offenders. Not really the best evidence, if I'm not gonna lie, but looking into the actual numbers provided in the tables, while it does hold true that other minorities are more likely to disproportionately commit a hate crime against Asian Americans compared to vice versa, if you calculate the total percentages of hate crimes committed against Asian Americans and separate them exclusively to minority involvement, you'll see that comparing black and Hispanic victims, Asian Americans also have a relatively higher chance to be victimized by non-white offenders at 25.5% of all hate crimes being committed against Asian Americans perpetrated by other marginalized communities. So, in revealing this data, we can see that not only is the narrative against black people not explicitly confirmed, but it's outright denied. Marginalized communities aren't behind the root of the hate crimes against Asian Americans. And delving deeper into the data and beyond that, we can see that the narrative about innocent Asian elderly women being the main victims of Asian hate crimes portrayed by actual legitimate media sources as a big crock of bullshit too. In fact, the Asian Americans most likely to be targeted for hate crimes are young adult men between the age ranges of 18 to 34. And to further prove this, looking directly at the table showing the numbers and percentages, we can see that the largest age range experiencing Asian hate crimes are those previously mentioned between 18 to 34 at 46.2%, and under 18 at 24%, compared to elderly victims of Asian hate crimes who fit into the category of 45 and above, comprise just under 15% of hate crime victims at 14.9%. And while most of y'all probably take me at my word, because like me, you probably watch these video essays in the background passively while washing dishes or doing something else, for those of you who are actively watching and review my sources and know how to analyze and interpret data, you might find yourself saying, "But perilousy.m, I read into the research methods and caveats provided in the academic paper you cited, and I know the data utilized to confirm the findings came from evidence provided through the National Incident-Based Reporting System taken from 1992 to 2014. While this is certainly a comprehensive review of Asian hate crimes with information spanning over 2 decades, it isn't inclusive of new events that occurred after the proliferation of Asian hate crimes caused by the pandemic. Maybe it could be the case that while it's not true on aggregate that black people have committed the majority of Asian hate crimes, it might be that black people were the largest uptake as perpetrators of hate crimes against Asian Americans after the COVID outbreak." If you happen to be one of those people, First off, what the hell is your smart ass doing watching my video essays and actually reviewing my sources? Like, no one is paying you to do this, dude, and I'm just watching out for you, but if you keep this kind of stuff up, you might end up as big of a loser as I am. And secondly, I knew you meticulous bastards would do this type of stuff, but while I might not be a data-containing robot, ain't no way I'm about to let Ophelius Maximus 25 roast my ass in the comments for academic research illiteracy, which is exactly why I preempted this crap and added it into the video. You see, while evidence towards these matters are still sparse, based on the research from the Virulent Hate Project analyzing data from Asian hate crimes collected in 2020, in the 184 incidents of anti-Asian hate crimes in which the race of the sources were identified, Black individuals were identified as offenders in 10 out of the 184 anti-Asian hate incidents at 5.43%. So not only does the narrative that Black people are the group responsible for the majority of Asian hate crimes not hold any veracity, when analyzed specifically in the context of hate crimes that occurred after the COVID-19 pandemic spurred a large influx in anti-Asian violence and rhetoric, the narrative proves outright opposite of reality. And also, in case you're curious whether the same holds true for the Asian elderlies and are wondering if they experienced a larger amount of attacks during the pandemic compared to before, the Viral Hate Project's data also have you covered by further demolishing the BS media narrative by displaying that senior Asian victims of hate crimes only composed 2.76% of the reported Asian hate crimes, which makes sense being significantly lower than the 14.9% shown earlier if you take into consideration that the larger percentage came from the category lumping in everyone 45 and older, while the age range for the elderly is officially recognized at 65 and up. And if we're just being real, in the same way that if you saw my eyes you could tell I was a yellow dude, it's probably easier to identify Black people from the color of their skin as compared to differentiating a Hispanic, Middle Eastern, East Asian, and white person apart. So while a large chunk of Asian hate crimes don't get reported, and the ones that do don't often have a perpetrator's race identified, my personal speculation is that hate crimes committed by Black people against Asian Americans are probably overrepresented. And I'm not going to drop evidence for this too because I'm too lazy and already did enough work, but I'm pretty sure Black people are also overrepresented in news and media when portrayed as criminals. There's a little something for y'all intellectual viewers to fact check me on. And it would make sense because Black people are severely overrepresented within carceral punishment in general. And while this topic deserves a deep dive of its own, done justice by a person representative of the Black community and not myself, I will give y'all a quick rundown of a few revealing stats. As of currently, according to the Pew Research Center, findings from analysis of 3 counties done by the Department of Criminal Justice show that Black people were admitted to jail at a rate at least double and up to 6 times that of white or Hispanic people, admitted to jail at a higher rate than other groups for both misdemeanors and felonies, and made up 12% of local populations but 26% of the jail population on average. And since the start of the pandemic, Black individuals in jail rose 8% compared to 0.4% for whites, demonstrating a clear inclination that the false narratives putting the Black community at blame for Asian hate crimes are likely causing genuine harm. Combining that with the fact that the United States Sentencing Commission has recognized that Black male offenders receive sentences on average 19.1% larger than similarly situated white male offenders, it would be of no surprise that they're also likely to be overreported as perpetrators of Asian hate crimes compared to other racial groups. So now that we know that Black hostility isn't the driving force behind the epidemic of anti-Asian racism and hate crimes, I guess solidarity does exist after all. But if that's the case, why do we still see a fair amount of Asian Americans spreading the false narrative? Well, it's probably because we're anti-Black. Okay, pause. This is post part 4 Angry Frog Dude here. While I was taking a break from writing part 5 and doing some casual research to make sure everything I said in this video was correct, I came across even more evidence used by the BS narrative spreaders online. While the evidence above was mostly developed during the peak of COVID era anti-Asian hate crimes, this article initially slipped my sights because it was posted in late 2020, far towards the end of the pandemic. And while I don't want to make a full section for a singular piece of evidence, I decided to make an exception because this crap really pissed me off. Basically, unlike the data I cited earlier, which was a response to the narrative that Black people are to blame for Asian hate crimes during COVID using evidence to prove otherwise, this article was a response to that response. This is Diane Yap. Diane Yap is a conservative Asian American who's a small part of a bigger systemic issue, but we'll get into that in part 5. As of currently, the important thing about her is that she is the author of an article titled The Hate Crime Distraction. published on the website City Journal. Now, in this article, Diane cites that black people are perpetrators of 27.5%, the largest chunk of violent incidents against Asian Americans. And she also throws in a few jabs of criticism at the two papers I cited earlier. But this is important because not only do these two papers demonstrate a differing reality to the anti-black narrative we keep hearing about, but also because a lot of racist peeps who got their posts deleted for inciting racial tensions and fact-checked in their ignorant beliefs are now defaulting to her evidence to keep the narrative alive. So let's break down some numbers and discern the truth of Asian hate crimes once more. Starting out her paper attacking the prior two pieces of evidence proving that black people were not the majority of perpetrators against Asian hate crimes, while she doesn't dismantle the core of these statistics, she mainly gripes that the sample size for the 2020 paper was a bit small and that the evidence recorded from 1992 to 2024 by the National Incident-Based Reporting System was too old, all of which are fair criticisms. But again, don't dismantle the reality painted in those statistics. Instead, she proposes another reality based on the victim criminalization statistics released by the US Department of Justice's evidence that was more recent than the 2024 paper and contained a larger sample size than the 2021, proving that black Americans were in fact the largest perpetrator groups against Asian Americans. Well, dang. Maybe the narrative is true, right? No! The problem is that her evidence is barely germane at best and completely unrelated at worst. First off, I opened the evidence provided in Yap's article and it literally sent me to the wrong tables. Girl, seriously? You're better than that. But after finding the actual evidence she cites herself, even worse, Diane Yap doesn't use data on Asian hate crimes to prove her point. She uses data from all violent incidents against Asian Americans. While she claims that using this data instead of hate crime data is fine because most violent hate crimes are unreported, this stuff literally includes non-consensual violations of a person's body, robbery, domestic violence, and intimate partner violence, none of which constitutes a hate crime. But even if we're gonna ignore all that and just focus on assaults, you can't just claim that all violent incidents against Asian Americans are done by default racially motivated hate crimes. And even if we did give her that, if you looked at these percentages, while black individuals were documented as the largest chunk of perpetrators against Asians at 27.5%, the next largest perpetrator groups were Asians and whites, both at 24.1%. And if you compare 27.5% to the two cases of 24.1%, that's barely any larger and definitely not significant enough to claim that black hostility is the root of Asian hate crimes. And guess what? It gets even worse. Similar to how she criticized the data in the 2014 paper as too old to be relevant to Asian hate crimes since the start of COVID occurred in late 2019, Diane sources her data from 2018, which also happens to be before the start of the pandemic. And she can't even make the excuse for this because she released her article in 2022. So naturally, as the petty person that I am, I decided to pull up both the 2019 and 2020 data released by the US Department of Justice, which were all released well before she wrote her BS article. I also pulled up the 2017 data on victim criminalization because why not? After sorting through nearly 100 pages, I finally found out why she decided to go with the cherry-picked data from 2018. Because 2018 compared to 2017, 2019, and 2020 was the only significant outlier where violent incidents against Asian Americans were higher than the year before and the 2 years after it, standing at a whopping rate of 16.2 for the violent victimization of Asian people compared to 6.9, 8.5, and 7.5 respectively for 2017, 2019, and 2020. It's clear that Diane was obviously smoking something when she decided to write her bigoted article. So if you ever see anyone cite her article or the stats used in the 2018 victim criminalization report to continue spreading the narrative that black people are the main culprits of Asian hate crimes, just tell them to shut the fuck up. It's honestly not worth the effort to spend hours explaining why their stats are wrong, and even after doing all this research myself, I'm starting to realize why a lot of video essays opt to lean more towards literary sources than statistical ones, cause this shit blows, dude. I don't want to read numbers anymore. Can we just move on to the next section? Wait a minute. This is my video essay. I don't need permission. We're moving on to the next section. Where were we? Oh yeah, Asian people are anti-black. Well. I bet my Asian viewers weren't expecting a segment criticizing them on a video about Asian hate. I mean, y'all wanted an in-depth review, right? And personally, I definitely wasn't satisfied with the Asian hate videos going around back when it was popular to talk about. So, if y'all want a thorough analysis of things, don't be surprised if the magnifying glass picks up a few specks of dirt. Cause if black people haven't been behind the majority of Asian hate crimes, why do some Asian Americans blame them? Cause we're anti-black, duh. But seriously, I'm not joking. Asian people really are out here being absurdly anti-black. I mean, I can't be the only one with immigrant parents who are straight up racist, right? And as we identified earlier, if the structures of American society are racist and a large chunk of Asian parents are also racist, surely it wouldn't be a leap of imagination to assume that the children raised under such influences might also have picked up on some racism. And in the case of Asian Americans and us liking free stuff, we took a boatload of racism. And to my black audience watching this video, be honest with me, how many of y'all thought I was about to commit an anti-black atrocity based on the title of this video? Hopefully, if you made it to this part, I've done right by y'all so far, but don't go expecting too much of me now. I already told y'all I had an edgy conservative phase in the past, and I'm still in the long road to unloading all that, but hey, if I'd been cancelled back then, I probably wouldn't have ended up the galaxy brained person I am today. And if anyone else watching this video is also galaxy brained and maybe a bit unsatisfied I might not have covered some things how y'all would have liked, just wait until part 5. I want it to be a bit of a surprise for those not in the know. As for Asian anti-blackness, while it's probably unexpected to think that a marginalized community could be so hostile towards other minority groups, if you put a little analysis into it, it actually isn't that surprising at all. You see, Asian Americans don't have an extended history in America. While you can trace their origins in America as far back as the 1850s, the majority of Asian Americans in America are actually first-generation immigrants, meaning that a large chunk of other Asian Americans are probably only 1 or 2 generations removed. Now, why might this contribute to anti-blackness and racial ignorance, you ask? Well, it's because Asians in Asia are anti-black. Just like examples of how South Korea appropriates black culture without care, China beginning attempts at colonizing Africa and their long history of oppressing the marginalized ethnic groups in their country, or India's caste system, Japan's xenophobia, or many other Asian cultures operating in a belief of colorism and looking down on those with darker skin, Asia is incredibly racist and oppressive. I mean, for fuck's sake, Asian countries aren't even able to get along with each other. And it's so bad that somehow made its way into Asian Americans not fucking with other Asian Americans of different ethnicities to them. Which is insane, because the peeps hate criming us en masse literally cannot tell us apart from one another. And it's not even them that are the only ones doing a significant injustice to our community. The Asian American community is so actively colorist that we're erasing South, Southeast, and any other darker skinned Asian people as our own people. While many people simply think that we're all well educated about Asian cultures as a whole because, well, we're Asian, those beliefs just simply don't exist. Asia is less racially diverse than America, and Asians from Asian countries have smaller minority groups as well. So it's not surprising that those originating from Asia who travel to America would still be ignorant towards minorities and marginalized struggles. After all, unlike Black Americans, Asian Americans weren't really disconnected from Asian culture and beliefs as the people deriving from the African slaves of the past were. Adding on to that, after arriving in America, a lot of Asian immigrants chose to settle down in areas with ethnic enclaves of their country of origin, as seen in examples with Koreans in South Central LA's Koreatown back in 1992. This choice of location often furthers their isolation from other American communities and reaffirms the beliefs, experiences, and cultures of which they grew up in Asia. Only once you get to the generation of Asian Americans who are raised during their youth purely in America can you finally find a population of Asian descent who have experienced similar experiences to those of Black and Native populations who have all been born and raised solely within America. So, in conclusion, if most Asian Americans are first-gen immigrants from Asia and almost all Asians in Asia grew up as members of the majority ethnic class because Asia barely has any ethnic diversity, and those in the majority class don't often recognize the existence of or concern themselves with the issues of minorities and grew up their entire lives without having to question that belief, why would they start distrusting any large spread narratives blaming a particular marginalized groups for all of their qualms or even begin making the choice to empathize with their struggles? You see, therein lies the crux of the problem. The majority of Asian Americans simply refuse to acknowledge their new social class as minorities who are oppressed by the majoritarians of another country. After all, if Big Back Tony was always the bully at her school, why would she expect to be bullied by another big-backed individual if she moved to a different school? And even if she did get bullied, would Tony even realize it? It's more plausible that she would instead still resort to bullying others below her on the pecking order in the new school that she has moved to, even if there did exist a new pecking order with which she was no longer at the top. In the same sense, the majority of Asian Americans simply refuse to acknowledge their new social class as minorities, which is why they buy into the stupid model minority myth. And rather than come to grips with this reality and work alongside other marginalized communities to gain further equality, they continue to view those people as beneath themselves and ought to remain believing that if they keep working at it, they can eventually fit in with the majority again and experience the vast wealth gained from violating the oppressed. So, with all that understood, it's not surprising that Asian Americans might be inclined to blame the black community. I mean, they're already anti-black, the legal system and carceral punishment system is anti-black. It's like two peas in a shitty pod. Both of these expressions of anti-blackness just set black Americans up as the ones to be overrepresented and blamed for Asian hate crimes. But of course, every group has its outliers, and I'm a pretty shitty kid. So just because my parents keep looking at me funny for bringing a black friend home doesn't mean I'm gonna stop trying to connect to others outside of some make-believe categories. Like, just because they couldn't achieve their American dream, suddenly should that mean that I have to do it for them? Maybe if you can't achieve something, even if you worked your hardest for it, you shouldn't live through your kids and push them to succeed in areas you couldn't accomplish yourself. In fact, maybe the dream is simply a dream and not an attainable reality. In the same sense, if my parents disapprove of who I surround myself with because of factors outside their control, should I suddenly abandon them to satisfy my bigoted parents?
Nah, I'm gonna do my own thing.
While it may sound weird at first, between marginalized groups, for the sake of solidarity, let's try to think of each other as the misguided uncle of our families with kinda crazy beliefs, but ultimately good intentions. Obviously, both sides of the table have a lot of ignorance and bigotry towards the other that we both need to work on independently, but that's no reason that we can't get along and help each other expedite that process. After all, while we may have different issues plaguing our communities, aren't we both still suffering from differing expressions of marginalization? And although we can never truly perceive the reality of being from another background, maybe if you let me borrow your J's for a mile and I let you try on my Temu Air Force Ones, we might get a better grasp of things that bring us together instead of apart. Also, I'm martially trained, so I can knock your block off standing. Although, if you shoot for my legs and start crotch sniffing, you could probably hold me down and beat my ass because I have abysmal takedown defense and zero ground game. But since us minorities are already pitted against each other, even if we never had any beef in the first place, let's just try to support each other. For example, if your shady acquaintance calls you out of the blue and tells you that they saw your partner kissing up another person, are you gonna start flipping out on your significant other, or are you gonna have a dialogue asking if it actually happened in the first place? I mean, even if your partner didn't do anything wrong and the worst case scenario happens where the shady acquaintance starts lying to your friends and family that your partner is a dirty cheater, at least you and your partner know that you still have love for each other, and it should be handled the same way with any racially negative narratives spread. We should try to have a conversation with each other first and squash the potential beef within our communities before it might proliferate and give praxis to any actual issues. But what should be done when an issue has already occurred? Well, then the offending party should probably apologize. It sucks to look back and admit this, but I was guilty of initially falling for these narratives, as I'm sure many other yellow and brown peeps just like myself were, and still are today. And it's easy to make excuses like I was young back then, cut me some slack, I was in my indoctrinated conservative phase, but I simply should have known better. America as a society should have taught me better. And it sucks that I had to do extensive research, cut through all this racially biased media bullshit, just to come to the coherent conclusion that everyone's gonna call me woke and crazy for. Like, where was my lecture on the LA civil uprising, Mr. Bedford? Maybe colorblind communism doesn't solve racial suffering after all. Like, what the hell is this, bro? I already have to deal with shitty parents, and now you're telling me I have to deal with a racially ignorant, absent, shitty society daddy too? This is some bullshit. But complaining aside, I still bought into the narrative. And I'm not gonna try to sugarcoat it, I'm gonna say it as it is. At one point in my life, I actually believed that black people were responsible for a significant amount of anti-Asian hate crimes that proliferated under the spread of COVID-19. And I was wrong for that. Impact is just as important as intent, so even though I might not have held bad intentions, that doesn't justify any impacts that could have resulted from those ignorant beliefs or have. Harming others warrants an apology, so before I continue any analysis or give any explanations, I apologize. I'm sorry to the black community and to the people who are harmed, are being harmed, or will face any harm as a result of my prior beliefs in such racist narratives. Now, I'm not saying all of this to avoid getting canceled or something, or because a face comes to mind when I think of my past beliefs with regard to who should be at fault for committing Asian hate crimes. In fact, if I hadn't admitted this, no one would have probably ever known. Besides having a fountain pen Instagram account and a Reddit account where I mostly post UFC memes, I basically have no social media presence, and up until COVID-19, I had no interaction with social media at all and continued to have none for at least fully 2 years after that. And barring this YouTube account, my social media presence is basically still my fountain pen account, which has been dead for at least over a year, and my Reddit account. So why am I admitting this? I'm admitting this to demonstrate that even though harmful narratives at best don't lead to any physical effects, they can still harm people they're targeted at and the person subscribing to such beliefs. Also, while I wouldn't be aware of how, maybe when I was walking in the street or going past a black person, I subconsciously put too much space between us when I walked around them. Like, some of y'all might think that's silly, but small things add up. If you've already had a bad day and you're a chronic overthinker like me, feeling otherized might be the cherry on top to make it go from a bad day to a horrible one. Also, even if it wasn't that serious, what if they thought they smelled or something? No one should be worried about smelling bad for the rest of the day, right? But analyzing my own thoughts a little further, if I didn't come across a TikTok spreading this narrative a few months ago, once again, shout out to Lance for sending me that TikTok, I probably wouldn't have felt the need to do a deep dive into this topic and challenge my own perception on things, even if I had changed substantially from the past conservative me and no longer held as much ignorance as I did then. Just as someone who still believes the narrative that putting Barack Obama into office signified a new hope for marginalized bodies of a post-racist society, not only have you been caught lacking, but you also would have been deluded into thinking that any racial progress was no longer needed or required as strongly. And with Asian hate crimes and the BLM protests only a few years back, clearly there's still a lot that needs to be changed. Also, for any black people watching this video, if me saying that about Obama angers you, first off, please watch the FD Signifier video on Obama and the myth of black excellence. He was cooking, and his 2-video series on Obama are criminally underviewed. I know, the dude's totally gonna appreciate a shout out from a no-name YouTuber. But secondly, if you're still trying to live in the belief that Obama really did enough during his tenure in office for marginalized bodies to stop having to worry about actively solving racism, then my stupid ass would have still been blaming y'all for beating Asian grannies in the streets. Thankfully, the gap between the marginalized experiences is not so wide that it cannot be gapped, and I'd argue that over time, the gap has been closing. Of course, there are moments in our history where we may still face setbacks in our path towards solidarity, and that should be abundantly clear with the blaming of black people for anti-Asian hate crimes that still persist to this day. But even for the Asian Americans who don't believe those narratives or never fell for them in the first place, unlike me, that still isn't enough. While someone may believe that all people should be treated equally, do they really understand why? I find myself often asking whether people who were taught and agreed that racism is bad growing up are actually much different from the ones that are taught that racism is good. Obviously, I'd much prefer the first option to the latter, but believing racism is bad because you were told so is really no different than believing a religion because you were raised to believe it. True value and ideals of equity are found when people actually make the conscious effort to sit with their beliefs and understand not just why racism is wrong, but why it presents itself and ways to resolve it. As leftists often get memed for saying, it's not enough to be non-racist, you have to be actively anti-racist. And while it sounds like a high bar to newcomers, active anti-racism doesn't have to be tangible actions like protesting, joining unions, or fighting to change legislation, but can also be an active choice to be consciously aware of how your perceptions of race affect reality. After all,
the revolution will not be televised.
And luckily for y'all, I'm dedicated to not just convey what has already been known, but to actively create and transform new ideas into digestible forms of thought. So don't just listen to my videos, actively engage with them, and make sure to watch them over and over and over again. It's a win-win situation. You get a part of my soul that I've cultivated for years condensed into a single video, and I get to pop off. But genuinely, to anyone watching this video, y'all are more than welcome here. I hope none of y'all watching have felt up until now that my videos aren't made for you, or that you're trespassing on some exclusive space. Even though I'll mainly talk about issues regarding Asian Americans, marginalized oppression is still something intrinsically connected between minority communities and all people of America. And because of that, these videos are made with y'all in mind just as much as yellow and brown peeps. So while some sections might make you feel uncomfortable at times, like I'm sure the section on Asian anti-blackness didn't make my Asian audience feel very good, ultimately it's for the sake of learning and growth, and we can all learn a few things or two from another. That said, even though I'm trying to approach this topic with as much empathy as possible, to all my marginalized viewers of non-Asian descent, please don't come at me saying stuff like, it's y'all Asians who are the ones causing issues in the first place, not us. First off, I ain't Asian, I'm yellow. I'll make this concept its whole separate video since Asian reevaluation theory is my brain baby, but y'all confusing the differences between Asians in Asia, Asians who immigrated here, and those born and raised here already tells me all I need to know that you're lacking in knowledge and understanding. And secondly, I am committed to not shitting on black people or any other marginalized group in this video, but 25.5% of hate crimes committed against Asian Americans by non-whites from 1992 to 2014, and even 10% in 2020 is a pretty huge chunk of Asian hate crimes, especially when the comparative committed by Asians against other minorities is like 1. But just as I made this video to bridge the gap and grapple with anti-blackness in Asian America, I hope y'all minorities who aren't of Asian descent might also do the same on the other end. Because people who are subjected to racism shouldn't be the ones responsible for solving issues utilized against them. So please, let's just get along. Like, come on, dude. This video is already long enough. I don't want to have to add a whole nother addendum on the LA Civil Uprising 2.0 20 years down the line. So, if we're good, then let's move on to part 5. Knowing now that black people haven't actually been the main perpetrators of Asian hate crimes, and understanding some of their frustrations with the Asian community, why is there still a decent chunk of this video left? Well, if you made it this far, first off, I want you to know that while I've covered the majority of this story pretty accurately, I've left out a few crucial components of context. Probably to the annoyance of other Galaxy Brain peeps watching. My bad, y'all. But I did tell you to wait for the surprise in part 5, didn't I? And why, you might ask? Well, it's because video essays aren't history books. Despite my abysmal editing and videography skills, YouTube, its algorithms, and its medium of video essays are designed functionally to convey an entertaining story, even if the contents of the story are educational in nature. And since we all know that I can't edit to save my life, I had to structure the script in a way that would still be engaging, meaning I had to surprise, hide, and yes, even gaslight you at times to squeeze every little bit of retention I could. And beyond that, while my primary objective has been to entertain y'all to both sit through and hopefully absorb all the information in this video, I also chose to format the story this way to demonstrate a point. That the techniques I've been using in this video to present what appeared to be a full story is no different than what occurs across all news. You see, if I just stopped this video after part 4 and came to the conclusion that there are understandable reasons behind why black and yellow and brown conflict occurs, and that black people are neither responsible nor should face blame for the proliferation of Asian hate crimes, it would have been real easy to end off with a message of kumbaya and how we should all get along and strive towards collective solidarity. And while us marginalized people certainly should do that, and this video could have closed with a warm, fuzzy, feel-good understanding of each other, that would have really tackled the core of the issue. Because while understanding why conflict between Asian Americans and black people is great and all, it doesn't explain why the tension exists in the first place. Y'all Wookiees are probably licking your lips right now, aren't you? And second, now that you've made it to this point in the essay, I'll let you in on a little lie that I've told throughout this video. Despite what I conveyed in the intro, the title of my video was never actually clickbait. In fact, there really has been a hidden group behind the majority of Asian hate crimes this entire time. And just as I've been feeding y'all select events and context up until now, without uncovering the full root of the issue, our media does the same as well. And even now, they're still dividing us currently, hoping to weaken solidarity and collective understanding behind marginalized communities. Except nowadays, it's not just the hidden groups' involvement in the news and our governments that are the progenitors of these false narratives, but also the very generation of children and adults who have fallen victim to their previous illusions that are spreading the hate themselves. And who has been playing us throughout these decades upon decades of American history? Well, the root of the issue is none other than white supremacy. That's right, y'all. You've been tricked into watching a video about critical race theory for the past 2 hours. And what kind of woke critical race theorist would I be if I didn't like shitting on white supremacy? Although, to be fair, if you haven't realized it by now and are just starting to get mad, good. Be mad. So, back to the core of the question asked earlier, if black people aren't responsible for the majority of hate crimes against Asian Americans, and the narrative has been false this entire time, why did the narrative spread that black people being to blame was an unspoken truth that the media refused to acknowledge, and who has really been behind it? Unsurprisingly, America is wildly anti-black, and a society of white supremacy would rather shift blame than take accountability. They did it turning Asian Americans into yellow perils. Obviously, they're gonna do it to the black community as well. After all, the news can't really report on a narrative that doesn't actually exist. Like, let's be so real for a second. Do you really think Tucker Carlson or any other Republican pundit would miss out on an opportunity to shit on black people? Really? Thus, it really has been the same system that has been enforcing ethnic zoning laws, Jim Crow laws, racially biased immigration, and slavery at the crux of the issue. Wow, who would have guessed? You know, sometimes the answer really is hidden in plain sight.
After all this time. All the way.
And it feels quite good to be able to talk about all this. Being the notorious yapper that I am, it was physically painful for me to purposely leave out details while writing the script to save the surprise. And if you know your stuff and are well versed in either history or critical race theory, you have noticed that there are a lot of unspoken things in this video that I've intentionally avoided saying up until now for the big reveal. Go ahead, rewatch the video after you're done later. If you pay as much attention to what I didn't say as to what I expressly did, you'll probably realize something new that I left out about white supremacy upon each replay. For example, who the fuck do y'all think came up with that model minority bullshit? You can't just call yourself something and expect society to suddenly agree with you. So obviously, Asians didn't do it. If that was the case, the government would declare that it doesn't commit war crimes, and Trump would have called himself the rightful winner of the 2020 election. Oh wait, they did try to do that, didn't they? But obviously, the government does commit war crimes and Trump is not currently the president. So, just as apparently, the concept of either being a model minority or yellow peril didn't derive from Asian Americans. And we've already established how other marginalized groups are negatively impacted by Asians having that status, and how some have competed over it for the past before it got solidified as something designated to all Asians. So clearly, it wasn't the non-Asian marginalized group who had something to lose if they gave the model minority up to another community who gave Asians that description. Plus, if you had the power to give yourself an advantageous social position, why wouldn't you give it to yourself instead of others? So, who was behind this bullshit? White people. Duh. Like, who the fuck do y'all think they were claiming Asian people were stealing jobs from back when they first made us out as yellow perils? OG Asian laborers weren't eligible for American citizenship and have been a thing since the 1850s, and slavery didn't end until the 1860s. It's not surprising that the so-called Americans whose jobs were being stolen from were in reference to white people, because anyone who wasn't white was literally not considered a human. And in the interest of not spoiling other tidbits about white supremacy pretty much causing all the events I've mentioned earlier in this video, let me put my apron on and really start cooking. Now, before I start shitting on white supremacy, I do think we should briefly chat about the popular art of doing so. After all, why does every video essay seem to transform into a critique of capitalism or white supremacy? Well, a lot of video essays end with solely critiques of capitalism because many white leftists still refuse to acknowledge marginalized voices. And for BIPOC video essayists, we discuss issues of capitalism and white supremacy because they suck and work in tandem to magnify our impression. Basically, these topics keep getting discussed because the root of our issues haven't changed since the foundations of America. And before y'all start questioning if the two concepts can really be blamed for the majority of marginalized sufferings, have you ever had the experience in your life where you took a test or something that you were very knowledgeable on and then picked the exact same answer choice 4 times in a row and start questioning yourself even though you've been confident of each answer choice individually? Well, white supremacy is kind of like that. After so much analysis and research spanning over decades, and the issues affecting minorities continuing to get narrowed down to a singular point, it should be unrealistic for us to begin having doubts, and everything just seems to line up too well for the conclusion of white supremacy being real. But it is real. And while I don't blame anyone for initially being suspicious of my claims, after all, this entire video has been one glorified yap session trying to refute a singular narrative regarded as an unspoken truth, so it'd be hypocritical of me to tell y'all to just believe me. Instead of leaving an angry hate comment that took you 3 minutes to write and ignoring all the points made in this video, why not do some digging yourself and sacrifice 3 months to the video essay gods to make a 5-hour rebuttal? Just don't get too mad when you end up like those flat earthers who attempted to disprove the roundness of the globe just to end up validating it. Okay, let's start trashing white supremacy. As I said earlier, both America's current and previous presidents grew up and became adults before America did away with segregation. It's easy to think of history as separate from the reality of the world today and to just say the past is in the past, but that simply doesn't work when dealing with systemic issues or trauma. Using myself as an example, it sounds insane to me that gay marriage wasn't legal across America until a little over 9 years ago, but I was 15 when the Supreme Court finally legalized it across all 50 states. And I don't think y'all are hearing me. I was in high school when gay marriage was finally universally recognized. And here I thought gay marriage had been a normal thing since I started watching Sesame Street. To my older audience members, y'all are probably looking at me like some ignorant kid right now, which I am, but that just goes to show how well time is used to erase our perceptions towards existing structural issues. Because even though gay marriage has been legalized and many racially discriminatory laws have been modified, many of the same people who vehemently opposed those changes are still sitting in office today. But maybe that's not enough to convince you of structural inequality. So let's compare white supremacy to history's favorite example of evil, Nazis. It still boggles my mind how many people believe that once something is changed, the issues are gone forever. As if changing racist laws functionally removes any racism that existed before the change. But if you think of structural issues like a relationship, if your partner has cheated on you, even if they tell you that they've changed, and even if they have changed, can you really trust them in the same way that you did before they cheated? If not, that's called trauma. And since people love using examples of extremes, let's talk about Nazism. For the most part, everyone can agree that Nazis did some fuck shit, right? Like, if you don't agree, just click off this video, dude. You gotta go backwards through the entire alt-right rabbit hole of reading Mein Kampf to Steven Crowder, Jordan Peterson, Destiny, Sam Cedar, Contraports, and then to me until I can even begin to change your mind. But for those of y'all who are still here and agree that Nazis are bad, we can also agree that slavery and segregation was messed up, right? Well, in that case, let me just remind you that World War II ended in 1945, and yet neo-Nazis and people with swastika tattoos still exist today. And since we all agree that Nazis are bad, we can recognize the harm done by past Nazi ideals through the skinheads of today and admit that it's still prevalent, right? Well, in comparison to that, segregation ended almost 20 years after the fall of Nazi Germany in 1964. The only difference being that Nazi Germany and its political structures was systematically destroyed after their defeat in World War II. I mean, the political leaders of the Nazi party were literally executed while the country of Germany was dismembered and split in half. And yet, Nazis are still alive and thriving. For example, Putin literally used the argument that Ukraine is a regime of Nazi ideology oppressing ethnic Russians to invade the country. So clearly it's still a thing that people acknowledge exists. But what about racism? Compared to Nazism, white supremacy was also destroyed, right? I mean, haven't the laws changed? But what about the structure? The United States of white supremacy did not get systemically destroyed, and the only time our country split in half was when Southerners wanted to maintain slavery while the North was apathetic to it and only cared about abolishing it because they thought it would give them a financial edge over the South. Unlike what your school history books taught you, neither side cared about the slaves. The Civil War was literally two white groups having a capitalism dispute over whether slave labor or industrial machines produced more profit, with the winner becoming the dictator of American capitalism and having control over the other. So, what happened after the Civil War segregation ended? Did the political leaders get executed? Did the government structure that supported racism get annihilated? No. Most of the same politicians that supported slavery and segregation still sat in office the next year. And the system, while occasionally modified or adapted, is still the system we use today. Which is fucking insane. To illustrate this insanity, imagine if after the end of World War II and the defeat of Nazi Germany, we universally recognized that Nazism and throwing people in internment camps was wrong, but Hitler and the Nazi politicians were still in office and held political power. That's basically America with white supremacy. I literally do not know how I can make this more transparent to y'all that we are far from a post-racist reality. Between the racial discrepancies between criminal sentencing, house interest rates, job opportunities, education, and wealth, it should be obvious that we don't live in the United States of America, but under the white supremacy of America. And before any of the snide Europeans watching get on your ivory towers, y'all are just as bad, if not worse, than America in regards to white supremacy and racism. The only difference is that BIPOC individuals make up such a small percent of the European populations that y'all practically get away with it without any marginalized groups being able to voice their oppression at a scale large enough to be heard. And tying this back into narratives of racial violence between Asian and Black communities, it's clear that white supremacy doesn't just operate tangibly but also socially to pit marginalized communities against one another as a method of preventing collective resistance. But if these structures and issues are as pressing as I say they are, how have we not taken unified action against it currently, and why aren't more people aware of white supremacy? Well, that's because the system of white supremacy is a goated master manipulator. If you want to avoid your citizens waking up to the reality of white supremacy, the best way to hide it from them is to just avoid telling them. After all, the government is the system in control of our public education. But more than that, you can also sprinkle in a few lies. Akin to Drake being reliant on hits and a large casual fan base proclaiming that he's the GOAT to solidify his status in the rap world despite him being a substance-lacking culture vulture. The United States relies on a large pool of ignorance and blind nationalism within its citizens to declare itself the greatest country in the world, while occasionally passing decent legislation to appease any potential detractors. And clearly, since you can't rely on the government to fix its own white supremacy, or Drake to be beneficial to Black American culture, or an Asian Canadian YouTuber's 38-minute video on the model minority myth to properly convey all the nuances behind Asian American marginalization, our status within white supremacy, and our involvement in anti-Blackness, that's what I'm here for. So, since America has told some lies about us, I'm gonna tell some truths to you. Despite the mono-minority myth, or statistics ignoring ethnic differences to convey monolithic Asian American success both financially and academically, we have never been white adjacent. Just as any other marginalized group in America, white supremacy has never accepted us. They simply tolerated us when it proved useful to leverage us as a barrier between other minorities. Because if they didn't detest us, then why were we ever made out to be job-stealing yellow perils in the first place? After all, don't liberals and conservatives venerate capitalism and free market competition? If so, then why blame the OG Asian laborers for stealing jobs when white citizens were too lazy to work for measly wages under life-threatening conditions? If capitalism and love for Asians was all it was cracked up to be, then why didn't the white people just pull themselves up by the bootstraps harder instead of complaining and killing Asian workers? Well, it's probably because they never saw us as humans in the first place. And even if you managed to achieve white adjacency, would you really enjoy life more as a subhuman in a world where whites are the only beings with humanity while every other marginalized group is considered non-human? You see, the problem is that a lot of Asians want white validation. In the same way that Asian tiger parents withhold their validation as a method to extract every ounce of their child's labor to achieve it, white supremacy holds the concept of white adjacency, i.e. the semblance of being granted any humanity, over the heads of Asian Americans. For many Asian American children growing up, we're taught that anything can be achieved via hard work, the good old American dream. For if you only managed to become a married millionaire doctor with 2 kids by the age of 25, could you finally achieve your parents' unconditional love and validation? And this framework of excuseless exceptionalism already sets us up for failure in regards to approaching marginalized oppressions. Our insecurities were instead capitalized on by the system that tries its best at maximizing labor extraction, and so the government tells us, if only you could achieve success despite centuries of structural inequality and prove that all other minorities aren't working hard enough and are asking for too much, could we offer you a taste of recognition and humanity? And so, because we've been raised to operate in this game without question by our parents, once we level up and gain the ability to vote and work within the system, we unconsciously begin competing and climbing as naturally as progressing from the concept of addition to subtraction. Unfortunately, even when made aware of these issues, they can still plague us. Using myself as an example, this script was originally intended to be around 40 minutes of speaking when I first began. But because I feel compelled to compete with others on YouTube and to cover the topic in as much depth and nuance as possible, it's now evolved into a multi-hour long video essay. And I'm still unsatisfied with my coverage of the model minority myth, the yellow peril trope, and the LA civil uprising, which are all issues deserving of their own videos, probably much longer than a video about a singular false narrative. And the only reason why part 1 wasn't 8 hours is the same reason I'm saying all of this now. YouTube demands its creators compete and maximize their viewer retention. I'm well aware that if I didn't get to the point, then most of the people watching this video would have never gotten to this part. In the same way that I'm aware that this conversation could have never been placed until the latter half of my essay. Cause people come to YouTube looking for entertainment and value, not to hear some random stranger talk about themselves. Of course, now that we've finally made it to this point in the video and you found value in my analysis, entertainment in my jokes, and feel that you may even know me a little, I'm well aware that adding a touch of personalization is the cherry on top to make y'all truly hooked to my channel. And if I continue this trend for a few more videos, some of y'all will probably find yourselves wanting a Q&A to get some more of my thoughts and lore. So yes, despite being aware of it, the capitalism monster has already gotten me. But don't feel too bad for me, cause I actually enjoy making video essays. The alternative would have been going to law school and eventually becoming a corporate scumbag, which by the way is still not off the table. So if you enjoy my content, find it transformative and valuable, or even feel bad for me and want me to remain a morally good person, please give me all your money. Trauma dumping aside, while Asian Americans want white adjacency and validation, they still don't understand that it's not something achievable. And that's because white supremacy simply refuses to acknowledge those outside whiteness as humans. If you remember my previous analysis during the segment of Asian anti-blackness, Asian immigrants see themselves in the same way as whites. The only difference being that while Asians recognize whites as equals due to centuries of Western hegemony, white supremacy just sees Asians as another chink, another dirty minority that besmirches the image of whiteness. So to the still disillusioned Asian peeps, y'all gotta stop seeking validation in white adjacency. It's literally no different from a toxic relationship where Asians work ceaselessly to make the relationship stable by protecting the concept of whiteness just to realize that they're not receiving reciprocal commitments. And if they complain, then they get called yellow perils and beaten before getting love bombed and told that we're the only minorities they'll love as long as we keep protecting them from the evil other minorities. Which kind of just proves all the studies that suggest people raised in abusive households are more prone to end up in abusive relationships. And if you're not aware of that already, then let me pull back the curtains a little more. Beyond examples of COVID being called
Wuhan, Kung flu, the Chinese flu, the China flu, they call it the China as opposed to the China.
By multiple politicians and associating an entire culture, country, and ethnic group with a disease that has garnered international hatred, we're really no different from other minorities. And the real kicker is that in Asian America's lengthy history of fighting against other marginalized communities to be seen as the good minority group, we lost the status that took us centuries of objectionless labor in a matter of months for a virus beyond our involvement. And in the same way that Asian Americans attained their status of model minority, if any other racial or ethnic group would have done it, I doubt it would have ended any differently. So instead of continuing to fight other marginalized allies, we should acknowledge that even though they have issues with Asian Americans, they can still relate to our struggle. Because real love comes from those who call out your problematic behaviors and want you to improve with the goal of fostering community, not those who seek to trap you in an endless cycle of meeting their expectation for scraps. So why don't we break bread and break down some actual statistics revealing who the real perpetrators behind Asian hate crimes have been. If any of y'all Galaxy Brain peeps made it to this point of the video and haven't left due to annoyance yet, I'm finally gonna get into some of the stats I've intentionally left out. Remember when I said earlier that you should consider re-watching the video later and paying as much attention to what was unspoken as to what I did speak? Well, when I cited a bunch of stats demonstrated that minorities only committed a small fraction of Asian hate crimes, considering my entire part criticizing white supremacy, where might y'all guess the largest chunk of Asian hate crimes actually comes from? That's right, Wiz Khalifa. I told y'all that homie was behind anti-Asian hate crimes. But no, you're actually right, it was from white people. Going back to the data provided by the National Incident-Based Reporting System, while marginalized communities made up 25.5% of the Asian hate crimes committed, the table reveals that white people committed the largest majority of Asian hate crimes at 74.5%. That's almost 3 times the amount of hate crimes committed against Asian Americans by all minorities combined. And if you recall the 2020 data by the Violent Hate Project, the evidence is even more incriminating. Combining all 148 cases of harassment and stigmatization where the race of the perpetrator was identified, while Black Americans accounted for 5.43% of all the incidents, white people were recorded as contributing to 89.6% of anti-Asian hate. And even if you separated those forms of anti-Asian hate into their distinct categories and give white people the benefit of the doubt, the lowest contribution of this category, which was physical harassment, was reported at 75% from white people, while the highest rate of contribution was seen in their involvement with political stigmatization at a whopping 95.28%. And remember Diane Yap, the author who attempted to prove the racist narratives with unrelated data? White supremacy was behind her shitty articles as well, since City Journal, the website she published it on, is funded by the Manhattan Institute, which is a conservative national free market think tank. So in conclusion, it appears that not only has white supremacy been spreading false narratives aimed at inciting violence between Black and Asian communities, but it's also managed to scapegoat its own guilt of committing the largest chunk of Asian hate crimes towards Black people. And at this rate, I might need to add a whole nother addition into the Asian anti-blackness segment for buying into these bullshit narratives and protecting white supremacy. But this wasn't just a single incident of white supremacy's involvement with inciting violence between Black and Asian communities. Remember the LA civil uprisings? Well, they had quite the involvement in that too, and they were even more successful than compared to their attempts during COVID. From the beating of Rodney King to the death of Latasha Harlins, there were plenty of interjection and involvement from white supremacist structures. In the case of King, it was clear when looking at the racial motivations behind the actions of the 4 police officers, but were you aware of the bias that affected the court proceedings? Beyond any singular actions or hate crimes that the news loves to focus on, we also need to take into account the racist systems that allow for physical attacks to occur. Even before the case against the officers ever reached the courts, the initial trial had already been biased. While the beating and arrest of Rodney King occurred in Los Angeles, which would typically dictate that the trial be held within the same county, before the case was held, the venue was changed from LA to a neighboring Simi Valley, which was composed of predominantly white people, with little to barely any Black Americans. As such, when the jury was selected from a community non-representative of King's original community, it was unsurprising that the almost all-white jury was predisposed to bias against King. In a similar situation, the case of Latasha Harlins was officiated by Joyce Carlin, an inexperienced white judge. And while the jury unanimously agreed that Harlins' killer, Sunja Du, committed voluntary manslaughter and deserved appropriate sentencing, Carlin decided instead to give her a slap on the wrist, only to later severely charge a man guilty for kicking a dog. And to make matters even worse, Judge Joyce Carlin was later recorded on tape justifying her decision by saying,
"I know a criminal when I see one. I know a person who presents a danger to the community when I see one."
And explaining that the death of Harlins was not a time for revenge for the Black community, as if they had wanted anything besides justice and equitable treatment. In any case, a judge should never base their verdicts and rulings upon their own perceptions of their ability to judge an individual as a criminal, and many others must have agreed, as the district attorney of LA later issued an affidavit policy disallowing Carlins from judging felony cases involving any violent crimes for the foreseeable future. That said, she still went on to get re-elected the year after and would later obtain various other positions of political power because of course she did. That's just how the system of white supremacy works. And it wasn't just the courts too, it was also the media who were guilty of constantly playing the beating of Rodney King before the killing of Harlins back to back repeatedly to nail in the message that Korean Americans had a role in both situations.
The media played a tremendous role in trying to play up that this was a conflict primarily between blacks and Koreans.
Every time when you turn on the TV, you see Natasha Harlin being killed by Son Ja-doo side by side with Rodney King being beaten up by LAPD to relate that Korean community was part of the oppressor exploiting black community.
And even then, the conflict between the black and Korean American communities were still overblown. Despite their gripes towards Asian Americans, the black community of South Central LA didn't hold an uprising specifically towards Korean Americans. They did it to protest the systemic injustice at the hands of white supremacy that had denied them equity and humanity. And the only reason why narratives were spun that the uprising was a conflict between two minority groups was so that white politicians could refuse to address the issues of marginalization.
What we saw last night and the night before in Los Angeles is not about civil rights. It's not about the great cause of equality that all Americans must uphold. It's not a message of protest. It's been the brutality of a mob, pure and simple. And let me assure you, I will use whatever force is necessary to restore order.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
And how can I say that despite admitting earlier that the majority of damaging during the uprising affected Koreatown? Well, do you remember those police departments and the National Guard that got caught to address the violence that never showed up? They actually did show up, just not in South Central LA. You see, we know this wasn't an Asian versus Black American thing, because despite the tragic death of Eddie Lee, out of the 63 deaths during the span of the LA Civil Uprising, only 2 of them were Asian Americans, while the majority were black people. And how many cops do you think lost their lives? 0. And that's because instead of being deployed in Koreatown, where the uprising had traveled and proliferated to, the militia were instead tasked with protecting the white neighborhoods surrounding the marginalized communities and containing the uprising within South Central LA.
All I was thinking, where is the police? Where is police? Where is police?
순경들 말이죠. 그 흔히들이고 멕시칸이 막 그냥 대낮에 도망을 가잖아요. 뭐 집안에 보고도 섰어요. 그냥 그런 나라인데 지금.
With the deployed 2,000, but those troops, I didn't see them. You know where other troops were? They were guarding Beverly Hills.
See, I told y'all this mono-minority bullshit was really just a buffer used to leverage Asian Americans as a meat shield to protect white supremacy from marginalized resistance. Fuck all that critical race theory nonsense. This actually happened in practice. I need to start calling this critical race reality, and y'all should start acknowledging it too, because Asian and black violence towards one another has always been exaggerated, and white supremacy has never ever cared about any of us. And if you need any more evidence of that, just look at how the government refused to help the business owners who lost their entire livelihoods after the property damages caused during the uprising.
After the riots, business owners expected government assistance in rebuilding their stores. Instead, many found roadblocks. The government, in conjunction with local communities, imposed new conditions for reopening.
Even though the Korean Americans were supposedly the good minorities who had done everything right up until that point, they couldn't get any aid or loans. And that scenario wasn't even unique to LA's Korean Americans during 1992. There was literally the Watts Rebellion that occurred in the same county 27 years earlier over racist practices by police like the incident with Rodney King. And after the damages that occurred during the Watts Rebellion, the government similarly refused to offer financial support and loans to the black community, which caused the financial strife that eventually allowed Korean Americans to usurp black American business owners. Low-key, white supremacy quite literally caused the destruction of black businesses, refused to offer them financial support after black Americans requested loans that they would have to pay back for an opportunity to participate in capitalism, just to later call them lazy decades down the line because they couldn't participate enough in capitalism that they were barred from. What the fuck? But thankfully, things aren't all bad. Well, it is, but not between minorities at least. Cause even though we have always been pitted against one another, we were still able to call white supremacy out for their BS and practice efforts of solidarity. In fact, despite Sun Jadu being one of their own, many Asian Americans were able to understand that both the killing of Harlan and the beating of King were wrong and that the black community was deserving of justice.
We stand together with all those who want justice in the King case. We must stop police abuse wherever it occurs.
Just as the black community, after the uprising aimed at white supremacy, recognized and sympathized with the struggling Korean Americans who are now left in a similar predicament to the ones they were previously after the events of the Watts Rebellion. Despite their differences and qualms, they were both still able to support each other and recognize the larger structures at play that oppressed their neighboring communities. Also, as a side note, I find it laughably funny how most of the Korean and black Americans interviewed had nuanced takes and could understand how they've been positioned against each other despite their qualms, while every time they interviewed a white person, the white person would just spout propaganda nonsense about how black people should work harder and pull themselves up by the bootstraps like Koreans instead of complaining.
The reason that immigrants have come to this country and succeeded is because they chose to grab the opportunity rather than complain about the environment.
Korean people come here with a language barrier, their children feel alienated, and they work hard and they seem to climb the ladder. Black people have had it very difficult, but blacks are Americans.
The bottom line, it's work. We work 7 days a week. I don't go out, or I'm not here and there and wasting my time outside.
Some things truly never change. But coming back to the present, COVID-19 was a little different. This time, instead of the damages and uprisings being isolated within marginalized communities, all of America endured losses, which is probably why you didn't see narratives that was an issue between minorities and such a strong suggestion that black people were behind Asian hate crimes as an attempt to spin the conversation that direction. And guess what? After a few of the white communities caught a bit of the roastings that we've had for centuries, these mofos decided to finally do something for us. Or at least they pretended to. Like, no offense to Nancy Pelosi, but us minorities don't want some optics of you wearing a kente scarf and kneeling. Just leak us your stock investments so we can be rolling in money. But if it's ever a sign that times may be thankfully changing, the response to COVID and the solidarity shown is a good sign of times to come. Of course, they're still out here trying to invalidate our struggles and spread fake narratives about minority race wars, but that's been a thing for a minute. As long as we don't fall for any stupid grifts or conspiracy theories, we should be good. But before you do that, hear me out. I know this segment of the video is going to sound perfectly normal after I record the audio post completion of the script, but as I'm pacing around writing this, I am actively tweaking out and losing my shit. If y'all remember when I addressed the article The Hate Crime Distraction by Diane Yap, well, not only did I find it exceedingly hard to access any additional information needed to refute the article by Yap, but I also may have possibly come across an example of the government actively erasing statistics on Asian violence. Also, if I don't release future videos, just assume I was assassinated by the government for spitting too many facts. And if any FBI agent or something is watching this, please note that I don't actually believe anything I'm saying and I'm just LARPing as a crazy woke person. Also, I support Donald Trump. Now, remember that idiotic article posted by Diane Yap and her outdated ass stats from 2018? Well, there might be another reason why her article only included stats during that year. And I'm not trying to give her any credit or a pass for using outdated statistics, but after doing a crap ton of research trying to disprove her race perpetrator percentiles with more recent ones from times where the COVID outbreak was actually spurring anti-Asian hate, I realized that my frustration at not being able to find the tables past 2018 wasn't from any lack of effort, but because they didn't exist. You see, while they had a table for the percent of violent incidents by victim and offender race or ethnicity in 2018, as well as the year prior, 2018 was the only year that they had the inclusion of Asian Americans. Assuming since Asian Americans make up a small chunk of the American population, that they weren't included in the statistics until they finally got large enough to make it into the 2018 tables, it doesn't really make sense why we no longer showed up in the tables in the year after that, or that any similar tables suddenly disappeared after 2020 as well. Especially since as a percentile of the American population, Asian Americans are continuing to grow. So, while I don't want to start sounding like Alex Jones or anything, the government might be deliberately leaving out statistics to reinforce ethnic division as they had actively done in the past. Also, this is another unrelated conspiracy theory, but I'm not entirely against the idea that white supremacy might actively create and aid in the occurrence of uprisings that lead to significant damages in the marginalized communities if it keeps us from having the financial capital needed to garner greater autonomy. Like, as soon as we get far enough with financial capital to finally have influence in politics, boom, violent uprising occurs that causes us massive damages and forces our communities to rebuild for decades again, reliant on white politicians for aid. And on the subject of conspiracy theories, I might as well tackle grifters too. Basically, Diane Yap is trying to be a yellow-faced version of Candace Owens. As proof, she spouts all the quintessential anti-minority talking points, such as arguing against reparations, and that if we're going to give funds out to any descendants of slaves, we should use that money to send them back to Africa instead, generalizing all black people of a specific community as criminals, and wildly enough, supporting abortion. But only because she thinks that people who would consider aborting would have never made good parents, and that black people and other marginalized groups are genetically inferior in terms of intelligence and IQ from Asians and white people, and thus should be aborted since black women make up the majority of people getting abortions. Honestly, I'm speechless. I didn't even know Homegirl was wilding like that. Like, I only came across her abortion take while randomly researching the victimization stats, so who knows what other crazy takes she has. But more importantly, while it's entertaining to poke fun at her, it really isn't valuable. Instead of distracting ourselves with the grifters, let's instead examine how white supremacy uses these sellouts to push their agenda and whether we may be caught up in aiding it as well. As mentioned before in part 4, white supremacy likes using proxy racism, and Diane is a perfect example of that. And she also sells fake white adjacency to Asians by telling them to align themselves with whites rather than other minorities. It's almost like the same tactics of oppression used by racist individuals are also those used by a racist government. Wonder where they learned that from? But I'm sure Diane, like Candace Owens, are smarter than they let on. They simply realized that if they performed racism, they could get paid big bucks for it. What worries me more are those who perform it for free. You see, internalized racists do the exact same spiel as a Candace Owens or a Diane Yap, except they literally do it for free. They actually believe that crap too. So if you're one of the peeps out here spreading info about how black and Asian peeps are at odds, you're even worse than the grifters. Because the only difference between you and the grifters is that you actually believe the crap you're spreading and you're not getting paid a bag to do it. Like, come on dude, if you're gonna purposely spread harmful misinformation, at least get a bag for it. And it's wild saying this to actual bigots, but for as much hating on others as y'all do, some of y'all racists don't respect yourselves enough, and it really shows. So before you post any divisive tweet or racially ignorant take, if you're not gonna get paid for it, maybe just consider not doing it. And by the way, this is not an endorsement to go out and start grifting or doing marginalized peeps in and out of your community dirty for money. I'm just saying that it's dumb people spend energy hating for free and that racists are dumb. If you want to hate, do it properly. So let me demonstrate by giving y'all a masterclass on hating. It might sound jarring to hear me outright say this, but I hate white people. And before people start getting out of their chairs and beds in an uproar, I don't hate people who identify as white, okay? I hate the concept of a white person and whiteness, i.e. the term white people as a descriptive categorization. I hate the term, okay? Not any actual human beings. So please chill with taking things out of context, y'all. Although, I'm sure if my channel ever pops off, this will eventually get clipped and taken out of context in an attempt to bastardize my arguments. But look dude, to any of my detractors, even if I was wrong in this part of the video, I could still be right about 90% of the rest of this video. And even if you assassinate me or my character, that doesn't mean by default that you've killed my points that I've made in this video. I mean, I could literally get imprisoned for stealing a bunch of Miss Vicky's chips from a grocery store right now and become a certified felon, and that still wouldn't fundamentally disprove anything I've said in this video. So, what I'm trying to say to all y'all white people watching this getting mad is that humans all have faults. And while you may not support the creators behind certain thoughts or contents or literally anything else, that doesn't make what they created invalid. So if you don't like what I've said in this video, you're free to dislike me, but if you'd rather adopt another lens of which to view the world, whether it be a colorblind one or anything else, then you better disprove all the evidence and analysis I've brought up. But that's why I put this video out onto the internet. Y'all capitalists like free market competition, right? Then compete. Plus, if I'm already getting passionate haters angry over my first ever video, then I'm probably doing something right. And y'all got rage baited to skyrocketing your cholesterol, proving I'm a goated hater. So, to the salty white people who are mad that I called y'all out for benefiting from white supremacy at the suffering of millions of minorities, shut the fuck up, bitch, I don't care. We're literally dying by the thousands from systems benefiting y'all, while y'all have the gusto to get mad and blame an entire community of marginalized bodies when one white person gets harmed by a minority. Keep that same energy when it's us. Cause it's strangely ironic how it'll be the conservative alpha male mofos who will tell their kids to fight back against their school bullies that start getting their panties in a twist as soon as any amount of marginalized people start fighting back against their oppressors. But back to the topic at hand, the model minority myth and yellow peril trope weren't the only insidious creations that white supremacy concocted as a means to oppress others for the benefit of itself. It also created the idea of whiteness. And as a quick summary, whiteness isn't a real culture or concrete identity. It's more of the lack of one and a political tool used to marginalize. Remember when Irish people weren't considered white? Yeah, whiteness is just a method of grouping meant to benefit those within while suppressing those outside it for the sake of profit. Basically, it's fake. Just like the idea of being Caucasian. It's funny to call out white people for their caucasity, but the truth is that most Europeans don't descend from the Caucasus Mountains, and if being from there made you white, then Indians would also be white. So yeah, being white is as fake as me going Super Saiyan and firing a Kamehameha, which is sad because I tried really hard to fire that shit back when I was 12. But while the concept of whiteness is fake, that doesn't prevent the people and institutions that subscribe to this little white lie from causing tangible harms against those perceived outside of its framework. That said, I'm not gonna make a full-blown video on whiteness, y'all gotta sub and pay me for that, but I will end with this. It's sad that some arbitrary imaginary grouping rendered the culture out of European traditions in favor of a distilled concentration of white supremacy. I mean, y'all could have been seasoning your food this entire time, unless you're British. Imagine colonizing so many countries and cultures just to still lack seasoning. But in favor of staying on topic, I say this so we realize that whiteness or white adjacency should not be the goal of minorities. We should instead aim to be ourselves. Besides, white people already get enough love and admiration just for existing because they're white. So, as the hater that I am, to the white people watching this, I just wanted to tell y'all that y'all ain't shit. At least not for just existing. I mean, y'all have to do something for praise, right? Come on. Did you really think I was gonna make a whole video on how bad racism was just to say some racist shit at the end? Nah, I'm better than that. As a conclusion to this lengthy video, I don't know, I'm not summarizing all this. Just rewatch the entire video or something. And if you want to be set off with some kumbaya message about solidarity, feel free to rewind to the end of part 4. The stuff addressed in this video is really too complex to simply consolidate into a single paragraph. Well, not really, but I'm too lazy to do it. So I'll just send y'all off with some more yapping about my motivation for making video essays, some methods for Praxis and things you can do to actually help the situation and spread awareness, and finally, some quintessential e-begging. Now, for myself, watching other videos covering Asian hate or any other issues affecting yellow and brown people on YouTube is like watching my favorite manga get a subpar anime adaptation. No hate to any other Asian YouTubers out there making content on yellow and brown issues, but I thought y'all's videos were mid. Eventually, I got pissed enough to the point where I started writing this video and was like,
fine, I'll do it myself.
Because in reality, it hurts me to my core that these videos on topics directly affecting me and people like me that I care so much about lack the depth and nuance that I think is needed to really understand these issues and form solutions. This stuff is incredibly important to me, and I hope it might be the case for those of y'all watching too. So if you liked the video and think that the discussion of these issues may be valuable to you as well, then I just ask that you support me on my content creation journey. You don't need to support me with money, although I would not protest receiving any financial support for a 3-month unpaid project. but it would do just as much help if you shared my content with others who you think would also care, and if you subscribe to my channel and all that other e-begging stuff. In return, I promise I will try my best not to do us dirty and operate with the goal of bringing yellow and brown voices into a fold in a way that's productive and inclusive of fostering solidarity. And while I may occasionally make videos that capture a general audience that may not pertain to yellow and brown issues specifically, I will always hold our problems at heart. Plus, I need to please the YouTube algorithm. People unironically do not care about Asian Americans or any of our issues, so as a byproduct, YouTube also does not care about us. But I'm gonna talk about this stuff anyway, so stay tuned for the next video I'm cooking where I shit on Uncle Roger and expose him as a literal clown. Obviously, while tackling minstrelsy, Asian self-hate, and the effect of white viewership on a marginalized performance. I mean, y'all clearly watched this video to the end because you thought it was educational, transformative, and held value, right? Again, don't start enabling me to review Wiz Khalifa songs and become a commentary YouTuber all of a sudden. As for Praxis, or any action that's actually tangible with which you could do to create or realize change, while I don't believe it necessary of people to put their bodies on the line and that a mental framework shift is enough to plant the seeds for monumental changes, joining in local grassroots organizations, petitioning local legislators to pass more equitable policies and holding them accountable, volunteering at a soup kitchen, and even composting your food waste and organic trash would be great. I don't know if all those things will specifically help minorities, but they're still cool, and white saviorism sucks. So, if you're not a minority, please be conscious of your involvement within marginalized efforts of solidarity and racial justice so that you do not participate for yourselves and make things about you more than those seeking freedom from oppression. I don't even know why I'm addressing y'all specifically. YouTube has a primarily white audience, okay? So, I'ma just ignorantly assume that most of y'all watching this are white. Oh, support Palestine too, as well as other global issues in need of attention and aid. And to my fellow BIPOC peeps watching this, please just remember to take care of yourselves and to love yourselves more. There is already enough external and internalized hate wherever we go. And as stated earlier, white supremacy operates into categorizing us and erasing our individuality and humanity to make it easier to commodify and tackle us as marginalized groups rather than a collective organization. And that's how the government and corporations get you. While sure, you may have the same rights as they do you really think an individual can win against an entire business? You might be able to make progress in small increments by yourself, but it'd be far easier to raise a collective against an army. Thankfully, small actions, both mental and physical, do lead to long-term change. And as Gil Scott-Heron says, the revolution will not be televised. So, one way in which I'm trying to do my small part in this is by making these videos for y'all. Hopefully it can breed solidarity and raise awareness so further actions can result. And y'all can do your small part too. As I said earlier, white supremacy thrives off of categorization and stereotyping us. And what better ways could we combat this system than by smashing those exact stereotypes they place on us? One such example is the view that minorities are a bunch of money-grubbing penny pinchers, and us minorities often stereotype white people as unwilling to help those of marginalized bodies in need. So what better way than to smash these negative stereotypes of each other than to empty all your wallets into my Patreon linked in the description below. That's right, y'all, I lied about not wanting your monetary support. Give me all your damn money. The YouTube system refuses to pay me until I reach a certain quota of channel growth, so like any other disenfranchised individual still holding hope in capitalism, I'ma take my anger out on y'all instead. But in all seriousness, if you can donate, I would appreciate it. If you can't, that's perfectly fine too. Getting rich is only half of my motivation for making these videos, with clout as the obvious other half. So if you found any value or entertainment in this video and would like to see more in the future, you can like, subscribe, leave a comment, all that other stuff. It'd also help if you shared this video to others who you think might be interested. After all, those things are free, and us money-grubbing minorities love free shit.